Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most fascinating status symbols. Picture this. The year 802, somewhere in the heart of Europe, an elephant steps onto foreign soil for the first time in nearly 1,000 years. His name is Abul Abbas, a gift from the Caliph of Baghdad to Emperor Charlemagne. But here's the twist. Before Instagram had pet influencers flexing their exotic animals for likes and follows, European nobility were doing the exact same thing, except their followers were entire kingdoms, and their content could start wars or forge alliances. What if I told you that a single parrot knew more state secrets than most government officials? Or that an orangutan in a white dress dined at Napoleon's table with better manners than most guests? These weren't just pets. They were political weapons, symbols of power, and sometimes the strangest companions you could ever imagine. Now, before we explore this wild world together, I want to ask you something. If you're enjoying this journey into history's most unusual relationships, take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. But here's the thing, only do it if you genuinely find value in what we're discovering together. And I'm curious, where are you right now? Lying in bed? Sitting by a window? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and honestly, knowing you're out there listening makes these late-night storytelling sessions so much more meaningful. All right, let's dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let me take you back to a time when owning the right animal could change your destiny. So let's start at the very beginning, because to understand why European nobility became obsessed with unusual pets, we need to understand what these animals really represented. You see, in medieval and Renaissance Europe, there was no internet, no television, no way to instantly broadcast your wealth and power to the world. So how did kings and emperors prove they were more powerful than their rivals? The answer was surprisingly simple. They collected things nobody else could have, and the rarest, most impressive thing you could possibly own, a living, breathing creature from the other side of the world. Think about it this way. In the modern world, if you want to show you're successful, you might buy a luxury car, a designer handbag, or maybe post photos from an expensive vacation. But imagine living in a time when most people never travelled more than 20 miles from their birthplace. Imagine never seeing a photograph, never reading a travel magazine. In that world, if someone told you about an animal with a neck as tall as a house, or a bird that could repeat human words, or a spotted cat that could run faster than a horse, would you believe them? Probably not. These animals were like mythical creatures stepping out of legends, and if a king could show you one in person, walking through his gardens, well, that king must truly rule the world. Charlemagne understood this better than almost anyone. When that elephant, Abul Abbas, arrived at his palace in Aachen in the year 802, it wasn't just a generous gift, it was a calculated political statement. The Caliph of Baghdad was saying, "Look how far my influence reaches. Look what I can send across deserts and mountains and seas." And Charlemagne was saying to every other European ruler, "Look what allies I have. Look what I can command." That elephant lived for 8 years, and during that time, he became more famous than most nobles. People would travel for weeks just to catch a glimpse of him. He was, in every sense, the first celebrity pet. But here's what makes this even more interesting. Abul Abbas wasn't Charlemagne's only exotic animal. The emperor had 3 entire menageries, collections of creatures that included lions, bears, camels, monkeys, and exotic birds. And he wasn't unusual in this. Owning exotic animals had become an arms race of prestige. If your neighbour had a lion, you needed 2 lions. If your rival had a monkey, you needed a cheetah. it was competitive, it was expensive, and it was absolutely essential if you wanted to be taken seriously. Now, let me paint you a picture of what these early menageries actually looked like, because they weren't like modern zoos. There was no concern for the animals' well-being, no attempt to recreate natural habitats. These were symbols, trophies, living proof of how far a ruler's power extended. Animals were often kept in small cages or chained in courtyards. They were brought out for special occasions like diplomatic visits or grand feasts, where they would be paraded around to impress guests. Imagine being a visiting ambassador and your host casually walks you past a full-grown lion. The message was clear. If I can control this beast, imagine what I could do to my enemies. William the Conqueror continued this tradition in England. Around the year 1100 he began a collection of exotic animals at his manor in Woodstock. His son, Henry I, expanded it even further, and then we have the Tower of London, which became home to one of Europe's most famous menageries. King John, who reigned from 1199 to 1216, kept lions and bears there. Can you imagine that? The Tower of London, that stern fortress we think of today, once echoed with the roars of lions and the growls of bears. Later, in 1235, Henry III received 3 leopards as a wedding gift from Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. And here's a detail that will make you smile. A few years later, he received a white bear as a gift from the King of Norway, and this bear was apparently allowed to swim in the Thames River while attached to a long chain. Picture that for a moment. Medieval Londoners going about their business, and there's a polar bear splashing around in the river. But here's what I find most fascinating about these early collections. They weren't just about showing off. They were about demonstrating something deeper: control over nature itself. In medieval thinking, the world was a hierarchy. God was at the top, then angels, then humans, then animals. A king sat at the top of the human hierarchy, supposedly appointed by God. So if a king could command these wild, powerful animals, he was demonstrating that his authority came from the divine. He wasn't just powerful among men, he had power over creation itself, and the animals came from everywhere. Trade routes were expanding, exploration was increasing, and suddenly creatures that had only existed in travellers' tales were arriving in European ports. Elephants from India and Africa, lions from North Africa and the Middle East, monkeys from Africa and Asia, parrots from the Americas. Each animal told a story of connection, of trade networks, of naval power, of diplomatic relationships. When you owned a cassowary from Madagascar or a crocodile from Egypt, you were showing that your influence touched every corner of the known world. But let me tell you about one particular emperor who took this to an extraordinary level: Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor in the 13th century. Frederick was absolutely obsessed with animals, and not just as status symbols. He was genuinely curious about them. He was a falconer, and he wrote one of the most important medieval treatises on falconry. But beyond birds, he collected everything. And when he got married, he didn't just have a typical medieval wedding procession. Oh no, he had cheetahs marching in the parade. Can you picture that? A royal wedding, all the pageantry and ceremony, and there are trained cheetahs walking alongside the nobles. It must have been absolutely breathtaking. People who witnessed it probably talked about it for the rest of their lives. The cheetahs, by the way, deserve their own conversation, and we'll get to them in more detail later. But I mention them here because they represent something crucial about how these animals functioned. Cheetahs were hunting companions for nobility in India, Persia, and eventually Europe. They were trained like falcons, hooded, and then released to chase down prey. Owning a cheetah wasn't just about having an exotic pet. It was about having a functional, useful creature that also happened to be devastatingly impressive. You were saying, "I am so powerful that even the fastest land animal on Earth works for me." And this brings us to an important shift that happened around the 15th and 16th centuries. The Italian Renaissance changed how Europeans thought about animals. Instead of just being symbols of power or tools for hunting, animals began to be seen as objects of scientific curiosity. Wealthy families in Renaissance Italy started creating private menageries specifically to study animals, to understand them, to paint them accurately. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci sketched animals from life. Nobles would hire naturalists to care for and document their collections. The Villa Borghese in Rome, built between 1608 and 1628, featured extensive gardens with exotic animals that were as much about education as they were about prestige. But even with this new scientific interest, the competitive element never disappeared. In fact, it intensified. By the end of the 15th century, having a menagerie wasn't just something a king did, it was something every serious noble family aspired to. If you wanted to be invited to the right social circles, if you wanted marriages into powerful families, if you wanted political influence, you needed to demonstrate cultivation and worldliness. And nothing said worldly quite like a courtyard full of creatures from distant lands. The mortality rate for these animals was devastating. Most didn't survive the journey to Europe. Ships would leave African or Asian ports with dozens of animals, and only a handful would arrive alive. The conditions were terrible: cramped spaces, improper food, stress, disease. And even those that survived the voyage often didn't last long in European climates. Tropical birds would die in winter. Animals used to vast territories would sicken in small enclosures. But here's the thing that might surprise you. The high mortality rate actually made surviving animals more valuable. If 9 out of 10 elephants died on the journey, that one elephant that survived became priceless. Scarcity drove desire, and desire drove the trade. And it wasn't just the nobility acquiring these animals. The network of people involved was vast. Ship captains, merchants, trappers, handlers, translators, diplomats, all of them played a role. There were specialists whose entire career was travelling to foreign lands to capture specific animals for specific nobles. Nicolas Arnoux, for example, was appointed as the treasurer of the galleys in France specifically to manage animal acquisitions. His job was to coordinate shipments through the port of Marseille, to reduce mortality rates, to ensure that when King Louis XIV wanted an ostrich or a gazelle, Nicholas could deliver, and he wasn't alone. Men like Montnier-Gassion made around 40 trips to the Middle East and North Africa between 1671 and 1694, bringing back over 800 birds, including 103 ostriches, plus gazelles, goats, and sheep. Can you imagine that as your job description? Professional exotic animal procurement specialist. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. These animals weren't just sitting in cages being admired. They became characters in the political drama of European courts. When ambassadors visited, the menagerie tour was often part of the official schedule. Kings would strategically show certain animals to certain visitors, sending subtle messages. See this tiger? It was a gift from the Sultan. We have strong alliances in the East. Or, notice this elephant. We have the wealth and logistics to keep something this massive alive. Every animal was a talking point, a conversation starter, a piece of evidence in the ongoing negotiation of power. And sometimes the animals themselves became diplomatic gifts, passed from ruler to ruler like living letters. The King of Portugal sends an elephant to the Pope. The Caliph of Baghdad sends a lion to the King of France. The Sultan of Egypt sends a giraffe to the King of Spain. Each gift carried layers of meaning: gratitude, alliance, respect, intimidation, all of it encoded in the choice of animal. And the recipient had to respond appropriately, with gifts of equal or greater value. It was an entire language of diplomacy, conducted through creatures that couldn't speak a human word. So when we think about these early pet collectors, these original influences of the medieval and Renaissance world, we have to understand that this wasn't about love of animals in the way we might understand it today. This was about power, pure and simple. It was about demonstrating reach, wealth, control, and divine favor. It was about intimidation and alliance, about science and spectacle. These animals were living, breathing billboards that said, "I am powerful enough to bring the ends of the earth to my doorstep." And yet, I can't help but wonder about the individual moments. The emperor who genuinely marveled at his elephant's intelligence, the noble lady who grew fond of her parrot's personality, the child who played with a pet monkey and simply saw a friend. Because humans, even in the midst of power games, form connections. And some of these relationships, as we'll discover throughout this journey, became genuinely remarkable. But that elephant standing in Charlemagne's courtyard in 802, he started something. He proved that the impossible could be made possible. And from that moment forward, European nobility would never stop trying to outdo each other, to find the next incredible creature, to push the boundaries of what could be owned and controlled. And speaking of pushing boundaries, if you think an elephant was impressive, wait until you hear about what happened when the nobility decided that monkeys should join them for dinner, literally, at the table, with place settings. Because in our next part, we're going to explore the primates who dressed in silk, learned to use silverware, and in one case shared a bed with one of history's most famous couples. Trust me, you won't believe where this story goes next. There's something deeply human about wanting to share your dinner table with those you care about. But what if the guest sitting across from you wasn't quite human? What if they arrived in a white dress, had excellent table manners, and happened to be covered in orange fur? Welcome to the world of primates in European palaces, where monkeys weren't just exotic pets. They became confidants, companions, political symbols, and sometimes the most scandalous members of the household. Let me take you back to England in 1525. Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, sits for a portrait. The artist is Lucas Horenbout, the official court painter, and this isn't going to be just any royal portrait. Because sitting with Catherine, wearing a little belt around its waist, attached to a long chain she holds delicately in her hand, is a Panamanian white-faced capuchin monkey. Now, you might be wondering why a queen would choose to be immortalized in paint with a monkey, and here's where it gets fascinating. This wasn't just about showing off an exotic pet. Every element in a Renaissance portrait carried meaning, layers of symbolism that contemporary viewers would have understood immediately. In Catherine's portrait, the monkey is reaching past a coin she's offering, stretching instead toward the jeweled crucifix hanging at her breast. The message? Faith over money, devotion over worldly wealth. And this was painted right when Henry was beginning the long, devastating process of trying to annul their marriage. So Catherine was making a statement. I cannot be bought. My marriage vows are sacred. But beyond the symbolism, there's a simpler truth. Catherine genuinely loved monkeys. They reminded her of home, of Spain, particularly the southern province of Andalusia, where she'd grown up before leaving for England in 1501. Can you imagine that? Being 16 years old, travelling to a foreign country, learning a new language, adapting to a completely different climate and culture. And then, years later, holding a creature that brought back memories of warmth and childhood and everything you'd left behind. That monkey wasn't just a status symbol, it was comfort. And Catherine wasn't alone in this affection. Her sister-in-law, Margaret Tudor, Queen of Scotland, also kept a monkey and was painted with it. Throughout Renaissance Europe, monkeys had become the must-have accessory for any noble household that wanted to be taken seriously. But here's the catch. Only the extremely wealthy could afford them. The logistics were staggering. These animals had to be captured in Central or South America or Africa or Asia, then survive a journey of thousands of miles by ship, often taking months. Most died on the voyage. Those that survived commanded astronomical prices, so when a noble lady appeared with a monkey on her shoulder, or a monkey sitting beside her in a portrait, she was broadcasting a very clear message. We have connections across oceans. We have wealth beyond measure. We have access to wonders. But let me tell you about someone who took the monkey as companion concept to an absolutely extraordinary level. Empress Josephine Bonaparte, Napoleon's first wife, and her orangutan named Rose. Picture this: Paris in the early 1800s, the Bonaparte household gleaming with imperial prestige, and living among them a young female orangutan, dressed in a white cotton chemise, who dined at the table with the emperor and empress, not kept in a cage, not chained in a courtyard, at the table. According to contemporary accounts, Rose had been meticulously trained by Josephine. She could use a knife and fork. Her table manners were reportedly better than those of many human guests. She had a particular fondness for turnips, which were served to her on fine china. And the rumours, scandalous as they were, suggested that Rose even slept in bed with Josephine and Napoleon. Can you imagine being a visiting diplomat, arriving for a state dinner, and realizing that one of your fellow diners is an ape in a dress? The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming, and yet this was Josephine's world. She had an entire menagerie of exotic animals at their country estate, Malmaison. But Rose was special. Rose was family. Sadly, Rose didn't adapt well to the French climate or the indulgent lifestyle. Within a year of joining the Bonaparte household, she died. Josephine mourned her genuinely. But in an act that shows how these personal relationships intersected with scientific curiosity, Josephine donated Rose's body to the French scientist Georges Cuvier. He performed a detailed examination and published his findings in a work titled Description of an Orangutan and Observation of its Intellectual Faculties. So even in death, Rose contributed to human knowledge. But I can't help but wonder what Josephine thought, knowing her companion had become a subject of scientific study. Now let's travel north and back in time a bit, to the court of James I of England. His daughter, Princess Elizabeth Stuart, who would later become known as the Winter Queen of Bohemia, grew up surrounded by animals. Household records from her childhood reveal that she spent 8 shillings and 3 pence on strewing herbs and cotton to make beds for her Grace's monkeys, on mending parrots' cages, and on shearing her Grace's rough dog. 8 shillings and 3 pence. That doesn't sound like much until you realise that this was a recurring expense, and that it only covered bedding and cage repairs. The actual acquisition and feeding of these animals would have cost far more. Elizabeth didn't have just one monkey, she had multiple monkeys, and someone had to be employed specifically to look after them. In 1618, one of her ladies-in-waiting, Elizabeth Apsley, was officially given the responsibility of caring for Princess Elizabeth's monkeys at Heidelberg. The records refer to her as gouvernante to all the monkeys and dogs at the palace. Can you imagine having that as your job title? Royal Monkey Manager? and Elizabeth's affection for her monkeys lasted her entire life. Years later, living in exile in The Hague after her brief reign as Queen of Bohemia ended in political disaster, she still kept monkeys. She wrote letters to diplomats and military leaders, negotiating alliances and lobbying for support, and in those same letters she'd mention her monkey Jack, describing him as gnawish as ewer he was. That little detail tells us so much. In the middle of political turmoil, in the midst of trying to reclaim a kingdom, she still had affection and humour for her mischievous monkey companion. But not everyone found these primate housemates charming. There's a deliciously petty historical detail about Princess Elizabeth Stuart receiving a monkey house as a wedding gift from her new husband, Frederick V, in 1613. During the wedding ceremony at Westminster Abbey, the teenage bride couldn't stop giggling during her vows. Historians suggest it might have been because she was thinking about that absurd wedding present. A house for monkeys. What do you even do with that? And here's the thing about keeping monkeys as pets in medieval and Renaissance households. It was genuinely difficult. These are intelligent, social, curious creatures with a talent for causing chaos. They needed constant supervision. They would steal food, pull hair, knock over expensive vases, and generally wreak havoc. That's why, in most portraits showing monkeys, you'll notice they're wearing belts with chains attached. Catherine of Aragon's monkey had one. Most royal monkeys did. It's a stark reminder that for all the affection, for all the elaborate care, these were still wild animals being forced into human spaces. Medieval records talk extensively about the challenges of keeping monkeys. They needed to be chained to heavy blocks to prevent them from climbing everywhere and destroying things. That image is both sad and telling. On one hand, nobles genuinely cared for these animals, commissioned portraits with them, wrote about them with affection. On the other hand, they kept them in captivity, chained, unable to express natural behaviours. The cognitive dissonance is striking. How do you reconcile genuine love with such restrictive control? And the symbolism of monkeys in art shifted over time. In medieval thinking, monkeys often represented sin, foolishness, base desires. They were seen as crude imitations of humans, capable of mimicking but not understanding. So why would noble ladies want to be portrayed with them? Well, by the Renaissance, that symbolism had evolved. Monkeys came to represent worldliness, access to distant lands, scientific curiosity. They were proof that you were educated, well-travelled, connected. And in a world where women's power was severely restricted, having a monkey could be a subtle assertion. I may be confined to domestic spaces, but I have access to the exotic, the foreign, the wondrous. There's also something deeply poignant about women forming bonds with these animals. Think about the restrictions on noble women's lives. They couldn't travel freely. They couldn't choose their own husbands. Their primary value was in producing heirs. Their conversations were monitored. Their friendships were political. But a monkey? A monkey was uncomplicated companionship. A monkey didn't care about your position or your political usefulness. A monkey just existed alongside you, mischievous and honest in its needs. And let's talk about the sheer absurdity of some of these situations. Picture a formal state dinner in a European palace. Everyone in their finest clothes, multiple courses served on gold plates, orchestras playing in the background, and at the far end of the table, an orangutan in a white dress delicately using a fork to eat turnips. The cognitive whiplash between extreme formality and complete surrealism must have been constant. Or imagine being a servant in one of these households. Your job description includes things like make beds for monkeys using herbs and cotton, and chase the monkey when it steals food from the kitchen, and clean up after the monkey knocks over the ambassador's wine. It must have been simultaneously ridiculous and exhausting. But here's what I find most touching. Despite all the status signalling, despite all the political symbolism, I think there were genuine moments of connection. Catherine of Aragon holding her monkey's chain, finding comfort in something that reminded her of home. Josephine Bonaparte laughing at Rose's antics at the dinner table. Princess Elizabeth Stuart writing about Jack's mischievousness with obvious fondness. These weren't just possessions, they were relationships, however complicated. And those relationships came at a cost we haven't fully addressed yet. Every monkey in a European palace meant a mother in Africa or Asia or Central America who'd lost her baby. The method of capture was brutal. Hunters would often kill adult monkeys to capture the young ones, who were easier to transport and train. The mortality rate was devastating. For every monkey that successfully reached a European household, dozens died during capture or transport. And even those that survived rarely lived long in captivity. The climate was wrong, the diet was wrong, the social structure was wrong. Most died within a few years. So when we marvel at these historical accounts of monkeys at royal tables, we also have to sit with the uncomfortable reality of how they got there and what their lives were actually like. Dressed in silk, yes, fed from golden plates perhaps, but also chained, confined, living in completely unnatural conditions, separated from their families and their natural environments. The legacy of these royal primates is complex. They advance scientific understanding. Remember Rose contributing to Cuvier's research. They influenced art, appearing in countless portraits and paintings. They demonstrated the expanding reach of European exploration and trade. But they also represent the beginning of the exotic pet trade, a practice that continues to threaten wild populations today. Now, if you're thinking that monkeys were the only animals sharing intimate spaces with European nobility, well, you're in for another surprise. Because monkeys might have joined them for dinner, but there was one species of animal that did something even more remarkable. They didn't just observe royal life, they listened to every word. They sat on shoulders during the most sensitive conversations. They learned state secrets, and occasionally they repeated them. I'm talking, of course, about parrots, and the stories of royal parrots will absolutely blow your mind. If wolves could talk, the stories they'd tell would pale in comparison to what the parrots heard. Imagine being a bird sitting on a king's shoulder while he reads classified military reports. Picture yourself perched on the edge of a breakfast table, listening to diplomatic conversations about war and peace. Think about being present for every private moment, every heated argument, every secret whispered in what people thought was confidence. This was the life of royal parrots, and their story is absolutely extraordinary. Let me introduce you to Charlotte, an African grey parrot who knew more state secrets than most government ministers. The year is 1880-something. A young British naval officer, 17-year-old Prince George, is stationed in Port Said, Egypt, serving as a midshipman on the HMS Buccaneers. And in the bustling markets of this port city, he encounters a bird that will become his companion for decades. Some accounts say he purchased her. Others claim she was a gift from his sister Princess Victoria when he was 11. But regardless of how they met, Charlotte and George formed a bond that would last through his entire transformation from sailor prince to King George V. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. Charlotte wasn't kept in a cage like most pet birds. She had free reign of the palace. She would sit on the king's shoulder as he worked through his official red boxes, those leather cases containing state papers and confidential documents. Can you picture that? The king of the British Empire, ruler of a quarter of the world's population, with a parrot literally looking over his shoulder while he read military intelligence reports, diplomatic cables, cabinet minutes. Charlotte saw everything. And African grey parrots, as any bird expert will tell you, have exceptional memories and remarkable intelligence. But it gets better. Charlotte didn't just observe silently. She picked up the king's phrases, his mannerisms, his very voice. She would shout, "What about it?" in what contemporaries described as a stentorious voice, mimicking the king's own questioning tone. She knew nautical terms from his naval days. She even learned a smattering of French, because that was the diplomatic language of European courts, and she was trained to proclaim, "God save the king," which must have been both charming and slightly surreal during formal occasions. The king's grandson, George Lascelles, the Earl of Harewood, wrote about Charlotte in his memoirs The Tongs and the Bones. He described family breakfasts at Windsor Castle, where the children would come down to play quietly in the presence of the king, and there would be Charlotte sitting at a table by the king's side, eating seeds or an apple core, occasionally perching on people's hands. The Earl particularly remembered his mother's hand, with Charlotte's claws gripping firmly. He noted that children had to remain still because Charlotte could sense nervousness, and her claws were formidable, her beak awesome. But what I find most touching is what happened when King George fell gravely ill. Charlotte paced. She muttered. She called out repeatedly, "Where's the captain?" using the naval term the king had always preferred. It's one of those moments that makes you wonder about the emotional lives of birds, about what they understand, what they feel. And when the king recovered enough to receive visitors, Charlotte was the first guest he requested. She flew to his shoulder, danced, bobbed, and exclaimed, bless my buttons, all's well." One of the king's friends, Louis Greig, wrote letters describing Charlotte as the most privileged member of the household. He complained with obvious affection and exasperation that damned parrot is still weird and makes straight for me every morning at breakfast, even when I come in quite quietly and never speak to it at all. Anyone who's ever lived with a parrot will recognize this behavior. Parrots choose their people, and they make those preferences very, very clear to everyone else. When King George died in 1936, Charlotte was included in his funeral procession, a parrot, in a royal funeral, mourning her human companion of over 40 years. If that doesn't tell you something about the depth of their relationship, I don't know what would. But Charlotte wasn't alone in the world of royal parrots. Let's travel back a bit further to the young Princess Victoria, not yet Queen, receiving a gift from her uncle Ernest I, Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. It was May 1836, and Victoria was 17 years old. The gift was a lory, a type of parrot native to Australia and Indonesia, known for spectacular colouring and playful personalities. Victoria was enchanted. She wrote in her journal, and I love this description, "Dear Uncle Ernest made me the present of a most delightful lory, which is so tame that it remains on your hand, and you may put your finger into its beak, or do anything with it without its ever attempting to bite. It is larger than Mamma's grey parrot, and has a most beautiful plumage. It is scarlet, blue, brown, yellow, and purple. Scarlet, blue, brown, yellow, and purple. Can you imagine how that bird must have looked in the gaslit rooms of a 19th century palace? A living rainbow, a splash of tropical brilliance in the grey English climate. Victoria loved Laurie so much that she had him painted, twice. Once in a group portrait by Sir Edwin Landseer titled Her Majesty's Favourite Pets, painted in 1838, where Laurie appears alongside Dash the Spaniel, Nero the Greyhound, and Hector the Scottish deerhound. And then again, as a particular sign of royal favour, Landseer painted Laurie on his own, a portrait Victoria gave to her mother, the Duchess of Kent, as a gift. Think about that for a moment. A formal oil painting of a parrot given as a meaningful present to the Queen's mother. That's how much this bird mattered. And Laurie wasn't Victoria's only parrot. Before him, she'd had a blue and green Brazilian parrot named Pedro. After him, she kept several African grey parrots who were highly trained. These birds could speak French, make jokes, and even toast the Queen's good health. Imagine being a dinner guest and having a parrot raise a metaphorical glass to Her Majesty. The Victorians must have been simultaneously delighted and bemused. But here's a question worth asking. Why were parrots so popular among European nobility? What made them different from all the other exotic pets we've discussed? Intelligence. That's the key. Parrots aren't just colourful decorations. They're among the most intelligent birds on Earth. African grey parrots, in particular, have cognitive abilities comparable to a 5-year-old human child. They understand cause and effect. They can count. They recognise themselves in mirrors, demonstrating self-awareness. They mourn their dead. And most remarkably, they don't just mimic human speech. They use it contextually. They understand, at least to some degree, what they're saying. So when Charlotte shouted, "Where's the captain?" during King George's illness, was she simply repeating a phrase she'd heard? Or did she understand in some bird way that something was wrong and she was calling for her companion? We can't know for certain, but anyone who's spent time with parrots will tell you there's something happening in those eyes, something that feels very much like understanding. There's also the longevity factor. Parrots live for decades. A well-cared-for African grey can live 50 to 60 years. Large macaws can reach 70 or 80. When you acquire a parrot, you're not just getting a pet. You're potentially getting a companion for your entire adult life. Charlotte was with King George for over 40 years. That's longer than many human friendships. That's longer than most marriages. She literally grew old with him. And then there's the element of interaction. Dogs are loyal and loving. Cats are affectionate on their own terms. But parrots? Parrots talk back. They have opinions. They make their preferences abundantly clear. They can be demanding, mischievous, stubborn, playful, tender. Living with a parrot is less like owning a pet and more like sharing your space with a very small, very opinionated roommate who happens to have wings. But let's be honest about something. For all the charm and companionship, keeping parrots in captivity comes with significant ethical concerns. In the wild, parrots live in large flocks. They fly dozens of miles every day. They have complex social structures. Keeping them in human homes, no matter how loving, is fundamentally restricting them. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, when all these royal parrots were being kept, there was zero understanding of proper parrot care. No specialized diets, no behavioral enrichment, no recognition that parrots need mental stimulation comparable to what young children need. Many parrots developed what we'd now recognize as psychological problems: feather plucking, screaming, aggression. These aren't signs of a difficult bird. These are signs of a highly intelligent creature suffering from boredom, loneliness, and confinement. And let's talk about the capture methods. Every parrot in a European palace meant a nest in Africa, Australia, or South America that had been raided. Often, adult parrots would be killed so their chicks could be taken, because young birds are easier to transport and train. The mortality rate during shipping was astronomical. Ships' captains learned to bring many more parrots than they needed, because most would die before reaching port. So when we admire the stories of Charlotte and Laurie, We also have to acknowledge the darker reality. These individual birds may have been loved and well treated, but the system that brought them to Europe was brutal, and it established patterns of exotic pet trade that continue to threaten wild parrot populations today. There's a particular poignancy in the image of Charlotte calling, "Where's the captain?" during King George's illness, because she was calling for her person, her companion, the centre of her world. But who was her person before she met George? Did she have a mate in Egypt, a flock, a life she was taken from? We romanticize these relationships, and maybe we should. Maybe Charlotte and George genuinely loved each other, in whatever way a human and a parrot can love. But we should also remember the cost. Yet despite all these ethical complexities, I can't help but be moved by the little details. A 2-year-old Princess Elizabeth, who would one day become Queen Elizabeth II, feeding sugar lumps to Charlotte. The image of that small child, carefully extending her hand to the elderly parrot who'd been her grandfather's companion since before her father was born. That's 4 generations of royal family connected by one bird. Or Queen Victoria, 17 years old, delighting in the fact that she could put her finger in Laurie's beak without being bitten, marvelling at his rainbow colours. There's something so human in that moment. For all her future power and majesty, in that moment she was just a teenager, charmed by a beautiful bird. These parrots witnessed history. Charlotte was there through World War I, through the fall of empires, through the greatest geopolitical upheaval Europe had ever seen. She sat on the shoulder of a king who watched the old world die and a new one be born. What would she have said if she could have truly understood and reported what she'd observed? But perhaps the most remarkable thing about royal parrots is how they humanized their owners. Kings and queens, people often portrayed as distant and formal, would talk to their parrots, laugh at their antics, mourn their deaths. Charlotte made King George, a man described by his grandson as emotionally reserved, express genuine affection. That's no small thing. Now, parrots could listen and talk, but what about animals who could hunt? Because nobility didn't just want pretty companions or clever conversationalists, they wanted partners in the chase. And there was one animal that combined speed, beauty, danger, and usefulness in a way that absolutely captivated the European imagination. An animal so extraordinary that emperors would keep thousands of them. An animal that would eventually be loved nearly to extinction. Let me tell you about the cheetah craze and how the fastest land animal became the most coveted hunting partner in history. Speed. Pure, unmatched, breathtaking speed. That's what made cheetahs the most coveted hunting companions in history. 70 miles per hour. That's how fast a cheetah can run. 0 to 60 in 3 seconds, faster than most sports cars. And for centuries, the nobility of 3 continents built their entire hunting culture around this one remarkable ability. But what started as admiration became obsession, and obsession, as we'll see, nearly destroyed the very thing they loved. Let me take you to India in 1555. A 13-year-old boy named Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar receives a gift that will change his life. An old courtier named Wali Beg presents him with a cheetah. Not just any cheetah. A trained hunting cheetah, already accustomed to human handlers, already skilled in the chase. The young Akbar names him Fatehbaz, which means victorious in battle. And from that moment forward, cheetahs become his passion, his obsession, his living symbol of power. Akbar would go on to become one of the greatest emperors in Indian history. His reign lasted from 1556 to 1605, nearly 50 years of expansion, consolidation, and cultural brilliance. and throughout all of it, cheetahs remained at the center of his world. But the scale of his collection was staggering in a way that's almost hard to comprehend. According to the Aini Akbari, the detailed administrative chronicle written by his court historian Abul Fazl, Akbar kept approximately 1,000 cheetahs at any given time. 1,000. Living, breathing, hunting cheetahs, each with their own handlers, each requiring daily care and training. But that's not even the most shocking part. Over the course of his 50-year reign, Akbar collected 9,000 cheetahs. 9,000. Let that number sink in for a moment. That's not 9,000 throughout history. That's 9,000 under one ruler in one lifetime. Think about the logistics. Every single one of those cheetahs had to be captured from the wild, transported, trained, housed, fed. An entire bureaucracy existed just to supply the emperor with cheetahs. Specific regions were designated as cheetah-catching territories. Professional trappers, many from a tribe called the Cheetahwala Pardi, made their entire living capturing these animals, and the capture methods were sophisticated. Early attempts involved deep pits, but cheetahs would often break bones falling into them, making them useless for hunting. Akbar, according to Abul Fazl, personally pioneered a better method: shallow pits with trapdoors. The pits were only 2 to 3 gaz deep, just enough to trap the animal without injuring it, and the trapdoors were ingeniously designed to close behind the cheetah as it fell. The method was so effective that on one memorable occasion, 6 male cheetahs tumbled into the same pit one after another, all in pursuit of a female cheetah in heat who'd been used as bait. But why? Why did Akbar need so many cheetahs? Because cheetah hunting, called coursing, had become the ultimate aristocratic sport. Here's how it worked. The cheetah would be kept hooded, like a falcon, to keep it calm during the approach. Handlers would bring it close to the prey, usually black buck, antelope or gazelle. At the perfect moment the hood would be removed, and the cheetah would see the prey. Then, like releasing a living arrow, they'd unleash the cheetah, and the chase was on. A trained cheetah could reach speeds of 70 miles per hour within seconds. It would close the distance to the prey in a matter of heartbeats, using its distinctive dew claw to trip the running animal, then delivering a suffocating bite to the throat. The whole event, from release to capture, might take less than a minute. It was over almost before human observers could process what they'd seen. The sheer acceleration, the explosive power, the precision, it was unlike anything else in the natural world. And unlike with falconry, where the bird might be somewhat unpredictable, or with dogs, where the chase could last for miles, cheetah hunting was elegant, controlled, spectacular. It was speed made visible, it was violence rendered beautiful. But there was one cheetah who became legendary, even among Akbar's vast collection. His name was Cheetah Nanjan. In 1572, during a hunting expedition near what is now the Jaipur airport, Akbar unleashed Cheetah Nanjan to pursue a deer, and what happened next became the stuff of legend. The deer, running for its life, came to a ravine. A deep ravine 25 yards across. The deer leaped, clearing the gap in a desperate bound. And Cheetah Nanjan in his pursuit did the impossible. He leaped after it, soaring through the air to a height of a spear and a half, clearing the ravine, landing on the other side and seizing the deer. Akbar was so impressed, so absolutely stunned by this feat, that he immediately elevated Cheetah Nanjan's status. The cheetah was given a jewelled collar studded with precious stones, and in a gesture that might seem strange to us but made perfect sense in Mughal court culture, Akbar ordered that drums be beaten before Cheetah Nanjan, the way drums were beaten to announce the arrival of high-ranking nobles. This cheetah had earned honour, recognition, a kind of knighthood. Another of Akbar's favourite cheetahs was Madan Kali, described in contemporary accounts as so extraordinarily beautiful, so striking in appearance, that Akbar declared him the head of all cheetahs. Madan Kali didn't hunt. He sat right next to Akbar's throne, a living emblem of speed and grace, a constant reminder of the emperor's ability to command even the swiftest creatures on earth. But here's the tragedy hidden in all this magnificence. Every single one of those 9,000 cheetahs came from the wild. Because cheetahs, it turns out, almost never breed in captivity. They need vast territories, specific environmental cues, complex social interactions that simply don't exist in human care. Akbar tried. Oh, how he tried. He gathered male and female cheetahs together in gardens. He gave them space, privacy, everything he could think of. But they wouldn't mate. They couldn't, in that artificial environment. Throughout Akbar's entire reign, with 1,000 cheetahs at a time, there's no record of successful breeding. Not one. The only documented case of a cheetah breeding in captivity in India happened decades later, during the reign of Emperor Jahangir, Akbar's son, in 1613, 1 litter, 1, and even that was considered miraculous, noteworthy enough to be recorded in the royal chronicles, so every cheetah in the Mughal menageries represented a cheetah taken from the wild. 9,000 captures under Akbar alone, and he wasn't the only one. Jahangir continued the tradition. He used cheetahs to capture over 400 antelopes in a single hunt near what's now New Delhi. Shah Jahan, Akbar's grandson, also hunted with trained cheetahs. The regional kingdoms of Rajasthan and central India all maintained their own cheetah collections, and this went on for centuries. The math is devastating. In the 16th century, there were an estimated 10,000 Asiatic cheetahs living wild in India. By the early 20th century, they were functionally extinct. The last 3 confirmed Indian cheetahs were killed by Maharaja Ramanuj Pratap Singh Deo of Korea in 1947. In 1952, the Indian government officially declared the cheetah extinct in the country. We loved them to death, literally. But the Mughals weren't alone in this practice. Cheetah hunting had been going on for millennia before Akbar. The ancient Egyptians were the first to train cheetahs for hunting, as early as 1550 BC. They appear in tomb paintings and hieroglyphics, collared and leashed, symbols of royal power. The practice spread from Egypt to Persia, where it became deeply embedded in court culture. Persian royal poetry from as early as 400 AD mentions kings hunting with cheetahs. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the fashion had reached Europe. Medieval Italy and France fell in love with cheetah hunting. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, that same emperor we mentioned earlier, who had cheetahs in his wedding procession, was an expert falconer and equally skilled with cheetahs. Charlemagne kept cheetahs. William the Conqueror had them. Throughout Renaissance Italy, every noble household aspired to own coursing cheetahs. And here's a detail that always strikes me as poignant. In 1513, when Pope Leo X was crowned, he received gifts befitting his new status: gold, jewels, precious manuscripts. And among those gifts, a trained cheetah, sent all the way from India, along with an Indian elephant. Because nothing said, "Congratulations on your papacy," quite like the fastest land animal on earth. The Duke of Cumberland in England imported 2 cheetahs from India in 1764, a full 12 years before the species was even formally described by Western science. These weren't called cheetahs yet. They were called hunting leopards, or sometimes just tigers, because Europeans didn't have a proper name for them, but they knew they wanted them. And then there's the painting. George Stubbs, one of England's greatest animal painters, immortalized these cheetahs in a work titled A Cheetah with Two Indians. The painting shows a cheetah, lean and alert, held on a leash by two Indian handlers in traditional dress. It's a beautiful painting. It's also a record of colonialism, of animals and people alike being transported to serve European aristocratic whims. But why did this practice eventually die out in Europe? Why did cheetah hunting disappear from European courts by the mid-17th century, even while it continued in India for another 300 years? Several reasons. First, European climate. Cheetahs, adapted to warm grasslands, didn't thrive in northern European winters. They got sick, they died young. Second, logistics. As we've established, cheetahs don't breed in captivity, so every cheetah had to be imported, and importing animals from India or Africa to France or Italy was extraordinarily expensive and had a very low success rate. But there's a third reason, and it's fascinating. European hunting culture began to shift. The Renaissance saw the rise of scientific thinking, systematic study of nature, and gradually, the idea of keeping exotic animals in menageries evolved. Instead of wanting animals that hunted with you, nobles began wanting animals that could be observed, studied, displayed. The focus shifted from functional hunting companions to impressive exhibitions of diversity. Large animals like tigers and panthers, which looked more dramatic in cages, became more desirable than the sleeker, smaller cheetahs. So by the time the famous naturalist Buffon was writing in the 18th century, he'd never even seen a living cheetah. He'd only seen pelts, skins. The animal had been forgotten by European science, even though it had once been the darling of European courts. Meanwhile, in India, the tradition continued unabated, and then the British arrived. And the British, it must be said, made everything worse. They didn't just hunt with cheetahs, they hunted cheetahs. The colonial administration established bounty systems, 6 rupees for a cheetah cub, 18 rupees for an adult. Between 1870 and 1925, official records show an average of 1.2 cheetahs killed for bounty every year. That might not sound like much, but remember, by this point the population was already devastated. When you're down to perhaps a few hundred animals, removing even 1 or 2 a year from the breeding population is catastrophic. And the British didn't stop there. They also enthusiastically adopted the Mughal practice of hunting with trained cheetahs. They saw it as a way to ingratiate themselves with Indian royalty, to participate in authentic Indian culture. Except they didn't have the centuries of accumulated expertise that Indian handlers possessed. More cheetahs died in British care. More habitats were converted to agriculture. The remaining grasslands, already shrinking, were fragmented further by roads, railways, towns. The cheetah, which had survived for thousands of years, which had adapted to human hunting pressure, which had coexisted with multiple empires and dynasties, couldn't survive the combination of colonial exploitation and rapid modernization. By 1947, when India gained independence, only 3 were known to exist, and they were killed that same year. The irony is almost unbearable. The animal was beloved. Emperors wrote poems about cheetahs. Artists painted them with reverence and detail. They were given jeweled collars and honored with drums. They sat beside thrones. They were companions, not just tools. And yet that very love destroyed them. There's a Mughal painting from the 17th century that I think about often. It shows a family of wild cheetahs, the earliest known study of cheetahs in their natural habitat in India. The father relaxes in the foreground. The mother licks and suckles her cubs who bound and play around her. The sky behind them is golden, warm, peaceful. It's a portrait of contentment, of natural life proceeding as it should. and it's almost impossible to look at without feeling grief, because that world is gone. Those peaceful families don't exist in India anymore. But here's something worth remembering. That painting wasn't created as a hunting trophy or a celebration of conquest. It was painted by a Mughal artist who simply observed and appreciated cheetahs as they were, which means that even within a culture that captured and used these animals, there was also recognition of their inherent value, their beauty in the wild, the capacity to see worth in something without needing to possess it. Maybe that's the lesson. Maybe the story of the cheetah craze is ultimately about the difference between admiration and appropriation, between appreciating something's magnificence and needing to control it. Because the cheetahs aren't completely gone. They survived in Africa, and now, in an interesting twist of history, India is attempting to reintroduce African cheetahs to Indian grasslands. In 2022, 8 cheetahs arrived from Namibia, the country with the world's largest cheetah population. It's an experiment, an acknowledgement of loss, an attempt at restoration. Time will tell if it works. But as we think about those 9,000 cheetahs that passed through Akbar's menageries, or the hundreds trained by medieval European nobles, or the countless others captured and used throughout history, maybe we can hold 2 truths at once. The relationships were real, the admiration was genuine, and the harm was devastating. Now, speaking of devastation and devotion existing side by side, there's a place we haven't visited yet. A place where the scale of royal animal collections reached heights that would make even Akbar's 9,000 cheetahs seem modest. I'm talking about Versailles under Louis XIV, where an entire architectural marvel was constructed for the sole purpose of displaying exotic creatures. And unlike everything we've discussed so far, this wasn't just about hunting or personal companionship. This was about creating a living museum, a testament to French power, and an early attempt at what we'd now call scientific study. Let's step into the most elaborate menagerie Europe had ever seen. Architecture can be a cage. But what if the cage itself was a masterpiece? 1663, the architect Louis Leveau receives a commission that will change the course of zoological history. King Louis XIV wants something no one has ever built before. Not just a collection of animals, not just enclosures scattered across royal lands, but a permanent, purpose-built, scientifically organized exhibition space where exotic creatures from every corner of the known world would live on display. A theatre of nature, a living museum, the first true modern menagerie, and Leveau delivers something extraordinary. At the southern end of what would become the Grand Canal at Versailles, on 9 acres of carefully manicured land, he designs an octagonal pavilion topped with a slate dome. Around this central building, 7 courtyards radiate outward like spokes of a wheel. Each courtyard specially designed for different species, each visible from the elevated first-floor balcony that wraps around the pavilion. Picture standing in that octagonal salon, windows on every side, and being able to observe flamingos in one direction, ostriches in another, gazelles to your left, exotic poultry to your right. It was revolutionary. The ground floor, decorated with shells to resemble a grotto, had a cool room with water features, offering visitors respite from summer heat while still surrounded by the sounds and sights of the animals. The upper floor featured paintings of animals by Nicasius Bernaerts covering the walls, so even when you weren't looking out the windows at living creatures, you were surrounded by artistic representations of them. It was immersive in a way nothing had been before. Construction was completed in 1664, and Louis XIV had created his first major project at Versailles, even before the Grand Canal was dug, even before the main palace underwent its massive expansion. That tells you something about his priorities. The menagerie wasn't an afterthought. It was a statement piece. It said, "I can bring the entire world to my doorstep. Look what I command." And the animals began arriving. Hummingbirds, so tiny and jewel-like that visitors could hardly believe they were real. Parrots in every colour imaginable. Cassowaries, those massive, dangerous birds from Madagascar with their brilliant blue heads and razor-sharp claws. The King of Madagascar sent one as a diplomatic gift, and courtiers would marvel at its size and temperament, equal parts fascinated and terrified. Ostriches, with their impossible height and speed. Dromedaries, camels with their distinctive single humps, walking reminders of desert lands most French nobles would never see. But the true stars were the elephants. In 1668, the King of Portugal, Pedro II, sent an extraordinary gift, a female African elephant from the Kingdom of Congo. She was 17 years old when she arrived, measuring 6.5 feet from ground to the top of her back, and she became the sensation of Versailles. Everyone wanted to see the elephant. Artists wanted to paint her. Scientists wanted to study her. Courtiers wanted to tell stories about her. The elephant lived at Versailles for 13 years. 13 years of being fed a rather bizarre diet that, looking back, might explain some things. Every single day this elephant consumed 80 loaves of bread. 80! Can you imagine the bakery operation required just for one animal? She also received vegetable soup with rice, grass, and here's the part that's absolutely wild, 12 litres of wine, every day. This elephant was drinking more than most French vineyard workers. Somehow, on this diet of carbs and alcohol, she survived for 13 years. Although she did become lame in her later years, and had to be supported by a crane to prevent her from collapsing. When she finally died in 1681, her death was considered a major scientific event. The Royal Academy of Sciences conducted a detailed dissection, studying her anatomy, documenting everything. Her skeleton was preserved and still exists today, although it now resides in the Museum of Natural History in Paris, a reminder of Versailles' past as a centre of zoological study. But the elephant wasn't the menagerie's only elephant. In 1772, during the reign of Louis XV, a second elephant arrived. This one was Indian rather than African, male rather than female, and his life at Versailles was even more tragic than his predecessors. The menagerie by this point had fallen into serious disrepair. The water systems flooded regularly, turning the courtyards into quagmires. The buildings were deteriorating. Maintenance had been neglected for decades. This elephant, arriving into a neglected and unsuitable environment, never thrived. He's remembered for one peculiar talent. He could open wine bottles with his trunk, a trick that delighted visitors but speaks to how bored and understimulated he must have been. And then, in 1782, he escaped his enclosure and drowned in the Grand Canal. The polluted Grand Canal. Whether he was trying to cool off, trying to escape, or simply lost his footing, we'll never know. But that death encapsulates everything wrong with how these animals were kept. Because here's the thing about the Versailles Menagerie. It was architecturally brilliant. It was scientifically pioneering. It inspired copycat menageries across Europe. Château de Chantilly in 1663, Hetloo Palace in the Netherlands in 1672, Belém Palace in Lisbon in 1726, Belvedere Palace in Vienna in 1716, Sanssouci Palace in Potsdam. The Schönbrunn Zoo in Vienna, opened in 1752, directly copied Lavau's radial design. The Versailles Menagerie created the template for modern zoos, but it was also deeply flawed. The focus was on display, not animal welfare, on spectacle, not habitat, on what looked impressive to human visitors, not what the animals actually needed. And as the decades passed, as Louis XIV aged and lost interest in his exotic pets, as Louis XV largely ignored the menagerie, as Louis XVI inherited a crumbling facility he didn't have the resources or inclination to fix, the animals suffered. Let me take you through the decline, because it's both fascinating and heartbreaking. During Louis XIV's life, the menagerie was immaculate. The king loved strolling there with favoured courtiers. He'd arrive by boat, sailing down the Grand Canal, making an entrance. Animals were gifts from governors and ambassadors competing for royal favour. The governor of Madagascar sent not just that cassowary, but also rare birds and lemurs. The East India Company, on their return voyages from Asia, Africa and the Americas, brought back creatures for the royal collection. One particularly dedicated animal procurer, a man named Monnier Gassion, made approximately 40 trips between 1671 and 1694, travelling to North Africa and the Middle East. He brought back more than 800 birds, including 103 ostriches in various shipments, plus exotic gazelles, goats, and sheep. Just imagine coordinating the logistics of transporting 103 ostriches across the Mediterranean. The mortality rate must have been staggering. But then Louis XIV started aging. By the time he was approaching 60, he'd grown tired of exotic animals. The novelty had worn off, so in 1698 he had the menagerie renovated and enlarged by Jules Ardouin Mansart, and then he gave it away, as a gift, to his grandson's 12-year-old wife, Marie Adélaïde of Savoy, Duchess of Burgundy. Now this might sound cruel, giving a child responsibility for an entire zoo, but Marie Adélaïde apparently loved it. She used the menagerie as an afternoon residence, a place to escape the rigid formality of court life. She had a pleasure garden added, that cool room with water features was maintained, and she even had a chapel built on the grounds. For a young woman trapped in the goldfish bowl of Versailles court life, the menagerie represented freedom, a place where she could be herself. But then Louis XIV died in 1715, and Marie Adélaïde had already died in 1712, probably of measles, at just 26 years old. The menagerie lost its patron. During the Regency period, when Louis XV was still a child, the menagerie was actively stripped of animals. The regent sold some, gave others away. When Peter the Great of Russia visited in 1717, he found the bird collection sadly depleted compared to the glory days. When Louis XV finally came of age and the court returned to Versailles in 1722, a lion cub and a tiger were brought in to amuse the young king. He visited once. After that, he built his own experimental menagerie elsewhere and completely ignored the official one. By 1751, the architect Gabriel wrote reports detailing the severe deterioration. Buildings were literally falling apart. Animals were living almost freely among ruins. And yet, animals kept arriving. Because diplomatic gifts don't stop just because there's nowhere suitable to put them. In 1770, a rhinoceros arrived. Can you imagine being that rhinoceros, travelling from Africa or India to France, and arriving to find your new home in shambles? The rhinoceros lived at Versailles until 1793, surviving through the Revolution, though Lord knows how. The Revolution, speaking of which, brought its own horrors. Most of the menagerie animals were either eaten by starving Parisians or sold off. By 1793, only 5 animals survived. 5 out of what had once been hundreds. The estate was taken over in 1800, and the last remaining animals were transferred to what would become the National Museum of Natural History in Paris. The buildings were demolished in 1802, ending the story of the Versailles Menagerie. Today, if you visit Versailles, there's almost nothing left. Aerial photographs show faint traces of the old courtyard layouts in the ground. There's a sentry box still standing, an outbuilding near the Pavillon de la Lanterne, but the octagonal pavilion, those 7 radiating courtyards, the revolutionary architectural design that changed how humans displayed animals, it's all gone. But here's what fascinates me. Despite all the suffering, despite the neglect and the eventual abandonment, the Versailles Menagerie genuinely advanced scientific knowledge. It wasn't just a vanity project. Surgeons, zoologists, and taxidermists frequented the menagerie. When animals died, they were dissected, studied, documented. Papers were published. Understanding of anatomy improved. The menagerie functioned as an outdoor laboratory. The animal painters who worked there, men like Nicasius Bernertz and Pierre Puget, created detailed, accurate representations of species that most people would never see otherwise. These paintings became reference materials, teaching tools, evidence that these incredible creatures existed. In an era before photography, before mass media, these paintings were how knowledge spread, and the menagerie established something crucial: the idea that animals from different parts of the world should be kept separately, in environments somewhat suited to their needs. The 7 courtyards weren't random. One held exotic poultry, another held predatory birds like eagles, owls, and crows, a third held small caged mammals, African civets, mongooses, badgers, porcupines, foxes. The largest courtyard, the basse-cour, held the biggest animals and also functioned as a farm, raising animals for the king's table: pheasants, Barbary sheep, goats, wild boar, Dutch and Flemish cows, and a dovecote for 3,000 pigeons. This classification system, this recognition that different species needed different conditions, seems obvious now. But in the 1660s, it was revolutionary. Before Versailles, royal animal collections were chaotic, with creatures kept wherever there was space, with no thought to their specific needs. Laveau's design, with its intentional separation and specialized courtyards, created a model everyone copied. But let's be brutally honest about something. For all its innovations, for all its contributions to science and architecture, the Versailles Menagerie was fundamentally about power. Louis XIV wanted the world to see that France controlled not just European territories, but had reach into Africa, Asia, the Americas, everywhere. Each animal was proof of French naval power, French diplomatic connections, French wealth. The ability to keep an elephant alive, fed and on display wasn't about loving elephants. It was about demonstrating that French resources were unlimited, and the visitors understood this messaging perfectly. When ambassadors from other courts visited, touring the menagerie was mandatory. They'd walk through, seeing creatures from their own lands and from competitors' lands, and the message was clear. France can access anything. France can acquire anything. What does your country have that we don't? The menagerie also functioned as a form of soft propaganda for the French public. On certain days, commoners were allowed to visit. They'd travel from Paris, spend the day at Versailles, tour the gardens and see the menagerie, and they'd go home telling everyone about the wonders their king commanded. It built loyalty, reinforced the divine right of kings, made Louis XIV seem almost supernatural in his capabilities. There's a particular poignancy in Marie Adélaïde being given the menagerie. This young girl, married at 12 to a man she'd never met, transported to a foreign country, expected to produce heirs and represent diplomatic alliance between France and Savoy. She had virtually no control over her life. Every moment was choreographed, observed, judged. And then she was given this place where at least she could watch creatures who were, in their own way, just as trapped as she was. Did she see herself in them? Did she feel kinship with these displaced beings, far from home, kept for display? We know she loved the menagerie. We know she spent hours there, that she had it renovated for her own comfort. But I wonder what she really thought. Looking at a cassowary from Madagascar or an elephant from Congo, did she ever think about their journeys, about what they'd lost? Or was she, like most people of her time, simply charmed by the exotic without considering the cost? The Versailles Menagerie represents humanity at its most contradictory, brilliant and cruel, innovative and thoughtless, scientifically valuable and ethically bankrupt. It's easy to condemn it from our modern perspective, but it's also worth recognizing that it moved us, however imperfectly, toward the idea that wild animals deserved study, attention, specialized care. The path from Laveau's octagonal pavilion to modern conservation zoos was long and winding, but it started there. And speaking of contradictions, of love and captivity existing side by side, there's another chapter in this story that we haven't explored. Because while some animals at royal courts were displayed like museum pieces, others lived intimately with their owners. They slept in bedrooms. They curled up on laps. They influenced culture and fashion in ways that architecture and science never could. I'm talking about an animal that went from being associated with the devil to becoming the ultimate status symbol. An animal that medieval monks debated keeping, Victorian ladies dressed in jewels, and one particular king famously despised after a very unfortunate incident. Let's talk about cats and how they clawed their way from outcasts to icons. Redemption sometimes comes on silent paws. There was a time when keeping a cat could get you accused of witchcraft, when cats were thrown from bell towers during festivals, drowned in rivers, killed for sport. Medieval Europe had a complicated, often cruel relationship with felines. They were associated with the devil, with dark magic, with feminine cunning, and yet somehow by the Victorian era, cats had become the ultimate symbol of refinement, elegance, and high society. How did that transformation happen, and what role did European nobility play in changing the cat's reputation? Let me start with a man who hated cats so much that it became part of his legend. King Louis XVI, the last king of France before the Revolution, husband of Marie Antoinette, a man whose life would end at the guillotine. And the cause of his feline phobia? He sat on one. Picture it. Versailles, sometime in the 1770s. Louis, probably preoccupied with matters of state, sits down without looking, and beneath him, a cat. The cat, understandably outraged by this assault, does what cats do. It claws him, right on the bottom, right through his royal breeches, the humiliation, the pain, the sheer indignity of being attacked by a creature weighing maybe 10 pounds. From that moment forward, Louis XVI despised cats. He reportedly took perverse pleasure in chasing them onto the roof of the palace. Imagine the King of France scrambling across rooftops, pursuing terrified felines. It's both absurd and sad. Because this king, who would face execution with dignity, who tried to reform France's finances, who was actually rather kind-hearted by royal standards, became known partly for his ridiculous vendetta against cats. But Louis was an outlier. By his reign, cats had already clawed their way into the hearts of French nobility. His own wife's predecessor in fashionability, Madame de Pompadour, the official mistress of Louis XV, had made cats fashionable at court. She kept beautiful, pampered felines, and suddenly every noble lady wanted one. Because if Madame de Pompadour, the arbiter of taste, the woman who influenced art and architecture and fashion across Europe, thought cats were elegant, then cats were elegant. But let's rewind further, because the cat's journey to respectability is one of the most fascinating redemption stories in European history. In medieval times, cats existed in a strange limbo. On one hand, they were useful. Every monastery, every castle, every manor house had grain stores, and grain stores attracted mice and rats. And cats killed mice and rats with efficient, silent expertise. So cats were tolerated, even valued for this practical service. But they were not loved. They were not pets in the way we understand the term. In fact, medieval religious thinking often linked cats to sin. Their nocturnal habits, their independence, their inscrutability, all of this seemed suspicious. Dogs were loyal, obedient, transparent in their affection. Cats were none of these things. Cats couldn't be controlled. They came and went as they pleased. They hunted at night. Their eyes glowed in darkness. To a medieval mind steeped in symbolism and superstition, cats seemed almost demonic. And during the witch hunts of the 15th through 17th centuries, cats, especially black cats, became explicitly associated with witchcraft. Women accused of being witches were said to keep cats as familiars, demonic spirits in animal form. Cats at witch trials were sometimes tortured or killed alongside their owners. The paranoia was real, and cats paid a terrible price for human fear and ignorance. But here's the fascinating part. Even during these dark times, some cats were living very different lives. Royal and noble cats, protected by wealth and status, existed in a separate reality. These weren't barn cats or street cats. These were companions, curiosities, status symbols. Isabella d'Este, the Italian noblewoman and Renaissance patron of the arts, received a cat as a gift in the early 1500s, and it was reported that this beautiful and delicate animal had no other home than in the arms of Her Excellency. That phrase. No other home than in the arms of Her Excellency. This wasn't a working animal. This was a beloved companion, a living accessory, something precious. And in portraiture, cats began appearing with increasing frequency, not as symbolic elements of sin or witchcraft, but as markers of domesticity, intimacy, private life. A woman portrayed with a cat was a woman in her private space, comfortable, unguarded. It suggested warmth, home, the feminine domestic sphere. But the real transformation came in the 18th century, particularly in France, and it happened because of one undeniable fact. Cats are extraordinarily beautiful. Their grace, their fluidity of movement, their luminous eyes, their soft fur, once you stopped seeing them as demonic and started seeing them as aesthetic objects, their appeal was overwhelming. Louis XV, despite his grandson's later hatred, kept a cat, a plump white Angora named Brilliant, and Brilliant had an absolutely extraordinary privilege. He would lie on the king's desk purring during meetings of the State Council. Can you imagine being a minister, presenting serious matters of governance, and there's a cat on the king's paperwork, being petted, demanding attention? It's simultaneously absurd and utterly relatable to anyone who's ever tried to work while a cat insists on sitting on their laptop. The fact that Louis XV allowed this, that he apparently found Brilliant's presence soothing enough to include him in official business, sent a message to the entire court. Cats are acceptable. Cats are refined. Cats are, dare we say it, fashionable. Madame de Pompadour took this further. She didn't just keep cats, she made them part of her carefully curated image. She was painted with them. mentioned them in correspondence, and selected beautiful specimens with the same care she applied to choosing furniture or commissioning art. And because Madame de Pompadour was the most influential tastemaker in Europe, what she did, everyone else imitated. Suddenly, noble ladies across France and then across Europe wanted cats. Not just any cats. Beautiful cats. Exotic cats when possible. Long-haired Angoras from Turkey. Persian cats with their luxurious coats. Cats that could be groomed, adorned, displayed. Isabeau of Bavaria, centuries earlier in 1406, had bought bright green cloth specifically to make a special cover for her cat. This level of care, this expenditure on cat comfort and appearance, was becoming increasingly common among the wealthy. Cats were no longer just tolerated mouses, they were fashion statements. But here's what's interesting. Even as cats became fashionable, they remained somewhat controversial within religious institutions. Nuns, in particular, seemed fond of cats, which scandalized religious authorities. Medieval manuscripts are full of marginalia showing nuns with cats. There are illuminations of nuns spinning thread while their pet cats play with the spindle. The affection is obvious, palpable even across centuries. But superiors constantly criticized this practice. Cats, they argued, had no place in sacred spaces. They were distractions from prayer. They were unnecessary luxuries. And possibly, though this was rarely stated explicitly, there was still that lingering association with witchcraft, with feminine power that men found threatening. Yet the cats persisted. Because here's the thing. For women living in convents, often sent there not by choice but by family circumstances, cats provided uncomplicated companionship. A cat doesn't care about your dowry or your family's political alliances. A cat purrs when it's content, regardless of your human status. In environments of strict hierarchy and limited freedom, that must have been precious. The 16th century scholar who wrote eulogies for cats, describing one as a scholar's light and dearest companion, understood this. Cats were companions during long hours of reading and writing. They provided warmth in cold rooms. They offered breaks from intense mental work, moments of play and affection that balanced scholarly seriousness. And crucially, cats fit into human spaces better than most pets. They're small enough for apartments and studies. They're relatively clean, grooming themselves constantly. They don't need to be walked. They're quiet, mostly. For urban nobility, for scholars, for anyone living in confined spaces, cats were ideal companions. By the Victorian era, the transformation was complete. Queen Victoria herself kept cats. Not just kept them, but commissioned paintings of them. Sir Edwin Landseer, the same artist who painted her beloved dogs, also painted cats. Cats appeared in royal portraits. Cats were exhibited at the first Crufts Dog Show in 1891, right alongside the dogs. Because Victoria showed 6 of her Pomeranians and people realised if the Queen valued her animals enough to show them, then all animals, including cats, deserved recognition. The Victorian middle class, always eager to emulate the upper classes, embraced cats enthusiastically. Cat fancy became a hobby. Breeds were developed, standardised, shown in competition. Persian cats, with their flat faces as long fur, became especially prized. People paid extraordinary sums for well-bred cats, and with this popularity came better care. People began understanding cat nutrition, cat behaviour, cat health. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, founded in 1824 with Queen Victoria as its first patron, extended its protection to cats. It became socially unacceptable to mistreat cats, at least among the classes who cared about social acceptance. But let's talk about the shadow side because it's important. The shift from cats as devil's companions to cats as status symbols didn't necessarily make cats' lives better. Breeding for appearance often meant breeding for traits that caused health problems. Flat-faced Persians had breathing difficulties. Inbreeding for specific colours or coat patterns led to genetic disorders. And the fashion for exotic cats meant cats were being imported from distant lands, with all the stress and mortality that entailed. Plus, the very fact that cats became fashionable meant they became subject to fashion's whims. When a particular breed fell out of favour, those cats were often abandoned, left to fend for themselves. The streets of Victorian London were full of stray cats, many of them former pets whose owners had decided they wanted a different, newer breed. There's also something worth noting about the gendering of cat ownership. Dogs, especially hunting dogs and large working dogs, were masculine, appropriate for men. But cats, particularly after Madame de Pompadour's influence, became associated with women. Feminine, decorative, less serious somehow. This gendering had consequences. It meant men who kept cats were sometimes mocked. It meant cats weren't taken as seriously in literature or art. And it meant the skill of reading cat behaviour, understanding feline communication, was dismissed as women's intuition rather than legitimate knowledge. But women who loved cats didn't care about these dismissals. They knew what they knew. They understood that cats were intelligent, communicative, affectionate on their own terms. They appreciated the independence, the self-sufficiency. Dogs needed you. Cats chose you. And for women whose own choices were often limited, whose own independence was restricted, there might have been something appealing about a companion who insisted on autonomy. There's a medieval manuscript where a cat is given a name, Crúbni, which means little paws in Irish. Someone, some monk or scribe hundreds of years ago, loved their cat enough to name them, to record that name for posterity. Little paws. It's unbearably sweet. It's also a reminder that even in eras when cats were officially suspect, when they were killed en masse during festivals, individual cats were being loved, named, mourned. The Black Death, that devastating plague that killed millions in medieval Europe, was made worse by the killing of cats. Fewer cats meant more rats meant more fleas meant faster spread of plague. The very animals that could have helped control the disease vector were being eliminated because of superstition. It's one of history's cruelest ironies. By the time we reach the modern era, cats have secured their place not just in noble households, but in human hearts generally. They're the second most popular pet globally, after dogs. They're internet sensations, meme generators, sources of comfort for millions. The stigma has not just lifted, it's reversed. Cats are cool now. Cats are aesthetic. People compete to post the best cat photos. But that journey from devil's familiar to Instagram star took centuries. And European nobility, for all their flaws, played a role in that transformation. By choosing to keep cats, display cats, paint cats, love cats despite prevailing superstitions, they helped shift public perception. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. The story of cats in European courts is ultimately about the power of fashion to change minds. Once enough high-status people decided cats were elegant rather than evil, everyone else followed. It's shallow in a way, but it saved lives. It changed how an entire species was treated. Fashion in this case had ethical consequences, and Louis XVI chasing cats across rooftops in impotent rage. He was fighting a battle already lost. Cats had won. They'd conquered European nobility one lap at a time, one purr at a time, and no amount of royal displeasure could reverse that victory. Now, speaking of small animals winning over royal hearts, there's an entire category of tiny creatures we haven't discussed yet. Animals so small you could fit them in a pocket, so cute that medieval chroniclers struggled to describe them without sounding absurd. I'm talking about ferrets in custom-made cloaks, squirrels with pearl collars, and weasels so well dressed they appeared in royal portraits. The world of miniature aristocratic pets was about to get very, very extra. Let's explore it. Sometimes the smallest creatures leave the largest impressions. We've talked about elephants that required cranes, cheetahs that could outrun horses, parrots that knew state secrets. But what about the animals you could fit in your pocket? The ones small enough to tuck into a sleeve, light enough to perch on a shoulder, cute enough to make even the most hardened medieval warrior go soft. Because European nobility didn't just collect the dramatic and the dangerous. They had a very particular weakness for tiny, mischievous creatures that could be dressed up, carried around, and shown off like living jewellery. Let me introduce you to the world of medieval micropets, where squirrels wore pearls, where ferrets had tailored wardrobes, and where an entire species of weasel became so associated with royalty that its fur literally became the symbol of monarchs. We need to start with Isabeau of Bavaria, Queen of France, wife of Charles VI, a woman who lived through some of the most tumultuous political upheavals of the 14th century. She navigated civil war, her husband's descent into madness, accusations of adultery, imprisonment, and exile. She was described by contemporaries as either beautiful and hypnotic, or so obese from dropsy she could barely move. She spoke French with a heavy German accent that never faded, giving her what one chronicler called an alien caste at court. And in the midst of all this drama, all this political manoeuvring, Isabeau had a pet squirrel. And in 1387, she commissioned for this squirrel a collar embroidered with pearls and fastened with a gold buckle. Just sit with that image for a moment. A queen, dealing with the complexities of medieval French politics, her husband experiencing what we'd now recognise as schizophrenia, factions at court tearing the kingdom apart, and she's having a pearl-embroidered collar made for a squirrel, with a gold buckle to ensure proper fastening. The cost of that collar, by the way, would have been astronomical. Pearls in the 14th century were rarer than they are today, each one hand-harvested from dangerous diving expeditions. The embroidery work alone would have required skilled artisans working for days. And the gold buckle, that was a statement piece. This wasn't just pet care. This was a declaration. I have so much wealth and power that I can afford to dress my squirrel better than most nobles dress themselves. And she wasn't alone in this extravagance. 19 years later, in 1406, Isabeau bought bright green cloth specifically to make a special cover for her cat. Bright green. In an era when most dyes were expensive, and green was particularly difficult to produce with any vibrancy. She commissioned cat clothing. But let's talk about why squirrels became such popular pets among medieval nobility. Because at first glance, it seems like an odd choice. Squirrels are hyperactive. They have very sharp claws. They bite when startled. They're not naturally affectionate the way cats or dogs are. So what was the appeal? Several things, actually. First, the cute factor. Medieval people weren't immune to the same evolutionary triggers that make us go "aw" at baby animals today. Squirrels have large eyes, small bodies, fluffy tails. They're objectively adorable. Second, the rarity. Red squirrels were native to parts of Europe, but keeping one as a pet required capturing it young, hand-raising it, and constantly supervising it. Most people couldn't do that. So if you had a tame squirrel, you were demonstrating patience, dedication, and resources. But there's a third reason. and it's fascinating from a status perspective. Squirrels move differently than any other common animal. They're acrobatic, capable of leaping incredible distances, climbing anything, defying what seems possible with their tiny bodies. Having a squirrel perform these aerial feats in your chambers or gardens was like having a living circus act. Guests would be mesmerized. And the squirrel's hyperactivity, which sounds like a drawback, was actually part of the appeal. It provided constant entertainment. Medieval manuscripts show squirrels frequently, often wearing collars and sometimes leashes. The collars served a dual purpose. They were decorative status symbols, but they also had rings where leashes could be attached. Because squirrels, unlike dogs or even cats, will absolutely run away if given the chance. They're wild animals, so every tame squirrel you saw was a testament to its owner's constant vigilance and control. Now let's talk about ferrets, because if squirrels were the adorable entertainers, ferrets were the useful companions who also happened to be stylish. King Charles VIII of France, who reigned from 1470 to 1498, bought a little red robe for his ferret. Not a collar, a robe, tailored clothing. Can you picture that? A ferret, which is basically a long, flexible tube of chaos with teeth, dressed in a custom-made red garment. How did they even get it on the ferret? How did they keep it on? Did the ferret appreciate the fashion statement or immediately try to wriggle out of it? Ferrets had been domesticated for over 2,000 years by the medieval period. They were originally used for hunting rabbits, their long, slender bodies perfect for diving into burrows and flushing out prey. This made them genuinely useful to nobles who hunted. But somewhere along the way, ferrets transitioned from working animals to companions. They had several advantages as pets. They're playful and interactive in ways that squirrels aren't. They can be trained, at least partially. They bond with their owners, and they have distinct personalities, often mischievous and entertaining. Medieval accounts describe ferrets as curious to the point of being nosy, getting into everything, stealing small objects and hiding them. Universities, interestingly, banned ferrets. Cambridge and Oxford both had regulations specifically prohibiting students from keeping them. The list of forbidden animals is remarkable. Dogs, birds, monkeys, deer, ferrets, badgers, foxes, wolves and bears. The fact that ferrets made this list, alongside bears and wolves, tells you how popular they were. Students kept sneaking them into dormitories despite repeated prohibitions. Monasteries had similar problems. Monks and nuns, theoretically dedicated to lives of prayer and contemplation, kept acquiring ferrets and badgers and weasels. Church authorities would issue stern warnings. No pets in sacred spaces. They distract from devotion to God. And the monks and nuns would nod solemnly and then continue keeping their small furry companions anyway. There's something almost rebellious about it. These people living in highly regulated environments, every hour of their day scheduled, every behavior monitored, and their one act of independence was keeping a ferret. I find that incredibly human and relatable. But now we need to talk about the most elite member of the weasel family, the ermine, also known as a stoat in its white winter coat. Because ermines weren't just pets, they were symbols of royalty itself. There's a legend, centuries old, about ermines. The story goes that an ermine would rather die than dirty its pure white fur. If hunters were chasing it and it came to muddy ground, it would supposedly turn around and surrender, rather than run through the mud and soil itself. Whether any real ermine ever did this is highly doubtful, but the legend stuck, and because of this supposed preference for purity over survival, ermines became symbols of moral integrity, chastity, and noble character. Ermine fur, with its white body and distinctive black-tipped tail, became restricted by law to royalty and high nobility. It trimmed coronation robes, lined capes, decorated crowns. When you see medieval portraits of kings and queens wearing white fur with black spots, that's ermine. Hundreds of pelts sewn together, each black tail tip creating a pattern like a constellation. And then we have Elizabeth I's ermine portrait, painted around 1585. In this painting, Elizabeth is dressed in black, covered in jewels, her hair styled elaborately. And climbing up her left arm, looking directly at her, is an ermine, a living ermine, painted as if it's a pet, though whether Elizabeth actually kept ermines as pets is hotly debated by historians. The ermine in the portrait wears a tiny crown as a collar, making the symbolism unmistakably clear. This represents royalty and purity. Elizabeth is holding an olive branch in her right hand, symbolizing peace. Near her left hand rests the sword of state, symbolizing justice. The entire composition is a carefully constructed political message. I am a virgin queen, pure as the ermine. I offer peace but can deliver justice. My authority is absolute and divinely ordained. But was that ermine real? Did Elizabeth actually have a pet stoat? Or was it purely symbolic? Leonardo da Vinci painted a similar portrait earlier, Lady with an Ermine, showing Cecilia Gallerani holding what appears to be a living ermine. But in Leonardo's case, the ermine was likely symbolic, representing the Duke of Milan who'd been granted the Order of the Ermine. The truth is, keeping an actual ermine as a pet would have been extraordinarily difficult. Ermines are wild weasels. They're carnivorous, with sharp teeth and aggressive hunting instincts. They're not domesticated like ferrets. They don't bond with humans easily. They bite hard, and they smell musky, a scent that comes from their scent glands and can't be washed away. So the ermines in these portraits were probably more about symbolism than reality. They represented the ideal, purity, nobility, elegance. The reality was messier. If Elizabeth actually tried to handle a live ermine for a portrait sitting, it probably would have bitten her, musk-sprayed her expensive dress, and leaped off her arm to explore the palace. But the other small mustelids, the ferrets and weasels and badgers that nobles actually kept, those were very real, and they lived fascinating, if often restricted lives. Medieval illuminations show ferrets on leashes being used for rabbit hunting. Women in elaborate gowns hold the leashes while the ferrets disappear into burrows. It's hunting, yes, but it's also companionship. These women spent hours with their ferrets, training them, feeding them, carrying them. Badgers, surprisingly, also appear in the list of medieval pets. Badgers. Can you imagine? Badgers are not small animals. They're powerful, with incredibly strong jaws and digging claws. They're also nocturnal and notoriously grumpy. But apparently some nobles kept them anyway. Perhaps they appreciated the badger's tenacity, its refusal to back down from anything. Or perhaps, once again, it was simply about having something unusual. The reality of keeping these small carnivores must have been challenging in ways we can barely imagine. These animals needed meat. Real meat. Fresh, if possible. In an era before refrigeration, before understanding of nutrition, how did you keep a ferret or a weasel healthy? You fed it table scraps of meat, probably. You let it hunt mice in the castle. You hoped for the best, and the smell. People often ask about medieval hygiene, and trust me, keeping multiple mustelids would not have helped. These animals have natural musk that can be quite pungent. In paintings and manuscripts, they always look pristine, with shiny fur and elegant collars. In reality, they probably smelled strongly, and their enclosures would have needed constant cleaning. But here's what strikes me most about these tiny aristocratic pets. The contrast. These are some of the most powerful people in Europe. They can command armies, order executions, start wars, and yet they're commissioning pearl collars for squirrels and red robes for ferrets. They're sneaking badgers into monasteries despite explicit prohibitions. They're having portraits painted with symbolic ermines to represent virtues they may or may not actually possess. It's humanizing, honestly. It reminds us that beneath all the political maneuvering and the displays of power, these were people who found joy in small, silly things. A squirrel's acrobatics, a ferret's playful theft of a button, the soft warmth of a small creature sleeping in your lap. And unlike the elephants and cheetahs we discussed earlier, these animals were intimate companions. They lived in bedchambers, not menageries. They sat on shoulders during private moments. They were there for the mundane hours, not just the spectacular occasions. A squirrel doesn't care if you're a queen or a peasant. It just wants nuts and a safe place to sleep. There's something equalizing about that. The fashion of dressing these animals is particularly telling. When you put a pearl collar on a squirrel, you're not doing it for the squirrel's benefit. Squirrels don't understand jewelry. You're doing it to display wealth, yes, but you're also, I think, doing it to make the animal part of your world. You're dressing it the way you dress yourself. You're including it in the aesthetic system that defines your life. It's a form of affection, however misguided by modern pet care standards. And some of these pets were genuinely loved. When a favoured ferret or squirrel died, there are records of noble owners mourning, commissioning tombstones even, writing poems. The attachments were real, even if the understanding of proper animal care was limited by the knowledge of the time. But we should also acknowledge the captivity, just as we have with every other animal we've discussed. A squirrel in a pearl collar is still a wild animal being kept in chambers instead of climbing through forests. A ferret in a red robe is still a creature bred from wild polecats, its instincts suppressed. The ermines that died by the hundreds to trim a single coronation robe never chose that fate. The medieval fascination with tiny pets continues today, of course. We have hamsters, guinea pigs, sugar gliders, hedgehogs. We dress them in costumes and share photos online. The scale changes, the technology advances, but the impulse remains the same. We want to share our lives with creatures smaller than ourselves, to care for them, to be entertained by them, to love them. And maybe that's not entirely selfish. Maybe there's something genuinely valuable about forming bonds across species, even when those bonds are imperfect and asymmetrical. Maybe Isabeau's pearl-collared squirrel brought her comfort during her husband's illness. Maybe Charles VIII's ferret in its red robe made him laugh during tense political negotiations. Maybe those monks and nuns with their secret badgers found peace in caring for something that needed them. Now, we've covered animals that ran, animals that climbed, animals that fit in pockets. But there's one category of exotic pet we haven't fully explored yet. Animals so massive, so powerful, so dangerous, that just keeping one alive required infrastructure comparable to running a small town. Animals that when they died, their deaths became scientific events, their bodies dissected before audiences, their skeletons preserved in museums. We touched on this briefly with Versailles, but there's so much more to the story. The story of elephants in European courts, and why your pet needing a crane to stand up is definitely a sign you've made some questionable choices. Let's explore the logistics of loving something that weighs several tons. Love, when measured in tons, requires infrastructure. We've explored the tiny pets that fit in pockets, the medium-sized companions that sat on shoulders. But now we need to talk about what happens when your idea of the perfect pet weighs as much as a small building, eats more food than 20 households combined, and requires architectural planning just to house. When your pet needs a crane to stand up, you've crossed a line. But European nobility crossed that line repeatedly, enthusiastically, and with stunning disregard for practical consequences. Let me tell you about England's first elephant in over 1,000 years and the bureaucratic nightmare that followed. The year is 1254. King Henry III of England is travelling through France when King Louis IX, his brother-in-law, presents him with an extraordinary gift, an African elephant. About 10 years old, 10 feet high at the shoulder, grey-black skin, massive beyond anything most Europeans had ever imagined, and Henry has to get this creature back to England. Now, imagine being the sheriff of Kent when you receive your orders. The king has an elephant, currently in Wissant on the northern French coast. Your job? Transport it to England. Oh, and the king would very much appreciate it if you could manage this by water, to spare the poor animal the walk. Good luck. The sheriff managed it somehow. The elephant was loaded onto a ship, ferried across the channel to Dover, then brought by boat up the Thames to London. The Exchequer reimbursed him £6, 17 shillings and 5 pence for this effort, which sounds quaint until you realise that at the time 2 pence a day was a labourer's wage, and £15 annually was considered sufficient to support a knight. Transporting one elephant cost nearly half a knight's yearly income, and that was just the transportation. Once in London, the sheriffs of that city received new orders: build a house for the elephant within the Tower of London, specifically within the Lion's Tower, home to the Royal Menagerie, a wooden structure 40 feet long by 20 feet wide. The construction cost £22 and 20 pence. Think about that. The elephant's house cost more than 3 knights' annual salaries, and this was before the animal had eaten a single meal. The elephant arrived in early 1255 and London lost its collective mind. This was the first elephant in England since the Roman invasion of 43 AD, over 1,200 years. An entire millennium had passed since the last elephant walked on English soil. People travelled for days just to catch a glimpse. The chronicler Matthew Paris made a special trip from his monastery in St Albans just to see and sketch the creature. And Matthew's drawings are fascinating because they show an artist trying desperately to capture something his brain couldn't quite process. He drew the elephant twice, experimenting with the trunk's position, trying to understand the skin folds, the odd proportions, the sheer impossibility of this animal. His notes described the elephant as having tough, leathery skin, using its trunk to obtain food and water, greyish-black in colour. These observations, obvious to us now, were revelatory then. He was documenting a creature that existed in bestiaries and legends but hadn't been seen in living memory. The elephant had a keeper named John Gooch, later replaced by a man named Henry de Flor, and maintaining this animal became a continuous financial burden. From December 1255 to September 1256, the costs were £24, 14 shillings and 3.5 pence. From September 1256 until the elephant's death in February 1257, another £16, 13 shillings and 1 pence. These were staggering sums for a single animal. And here's the tragedy. Nobody knew how to care for an elephant. There were no elephant experts in 13th century England, no veterinary manuals, no accumulated knowledge of elephant nutrition or health. Later records from the Tower of London mention elephants being given only wine to drink from May through October. Wine. As if elephants, in the wild, wander around consuming barrels of fermented grapes. The ignorance was catastrophic. Henry's elephant died on February 14th, 1257. 2 years after arrival, it was buried in the Tower's Bailey. But the story doesn't end there, because in 1258, Henry ordered the elephant's bones to be exhumed and provided to the sacristan of Westminster Abbey for purposes the historical record doesn't specify. Was he trying to recover valuable ivory? Did he want the bones displayed as a curiosity? Was he attempting to give the animal a more respectable resting place? Medieval bestiaries attributed faithful and gentle virtues to elephants. They associated them with biblical paradise and the redemption of Christ. So perhaps Henry wanted his elephant reinterred somewhere sacred, or perhaps he simply wanted the tusks. We'll never know. But the fact that a king bothered to order the exhumation of an elephant's body tells you how important this animal had been. And Henry's elephant wasn't unique in its tragic brevity. Jump forward to 1514, Rome. A different elephant, a very different set of circumstances, but a similar arc of wonder and heartbreak. King Manuel I of Portugal was in a delicate political position. Portugal's maritime expansion was threatening Egypt's monopoly on the overland spice trade, and Egypt was pressuring Pope Leo X to restrain Portuguese ambitions. Manuel needed papal blessing for colonization, he needed financial support for his fleets, and he needed to make an impression that would cement Portugal's importance. So he sent gifts, textiles worked with gold thread, a gold chalice, brocade altar covers, parrots, leopards, a cheetah, Persian horses, strange dogs, and an elephant. A 4-year-old Asian elephant, smaller and more docile than African elephants, who'd survived the impossible journey from Kochi on the west coast of India, around the Cape of Good Hope north to Lisbon. This alone was miraculous. Most elephants died on such voyages, but this one survived, was given to an Indian mahout trainer, and in 1514 began the long journey to Rome. His name was Hanno. Some sources say are known in Italian, a reference to Hannibal, who'd famously crossed the Alps with war elephants centuries earlier. And Hanno's journey through Italy was absolute chaos. Everywhere the ship stopped, Alicante, Ibiza, Palma, crowds mobbed the vessel. Nicholas de Faria, the royal equerry responsible for Hanno, had to stop making port altogether because they couldn't keep spectators off the boat. When they finally reached Porto Ercole on the Tuscan coast, Faria commandeered a galley to bring Hanno to dry land. They'd hoped to rest, but townspeople and farmers descended on them. The party moved to Tarquinia, where an eager crowd stormed the local inn. Those unable to find room inside climbed onto the roof. The roof collapsed under their weight. Hanno had to spend the night in the open piazza. At one point during the journey to Rome, they stopped at a cardinal's villa. The crowds climbed over walls, trampled vineyards, crushed gardens, all desperate for a glimpse of the elephant. Not even the Swiss guard could control them. Hanno, exhausted, his feet hurt by the hard Italian roads, had to keep moving. But when he finally entered Rome on March 19th, 1514, it was spectacular. Hanno wore a silver castle-like structure on his back. He'd been trained to perform. When he reached Pope Leo, sitting on his papal throne surrounded by cardinals and nobles and crowds of onlookers, Hanno's mahout gave a command, and the elephant genuflected on one knee, bowing to the Pope, who... Then he rose, trumpeted 3 times, sucked water into his trunk and sprayed everyone assembled, including the Pope. Pope Leo thought this was delightful. He was enchanted. Hanno became his favourite, participating in processions, festivals, spectacles. Leo commissioned Raphael, the famous Renaissance artist, to paint a life-sized fresco of Hanno at the entrance to the Vatican. The elephant became a symbol of papal power, Portuguese expansion, the wonders of the wider world. But in 1516, just 2 years after arriving, Hanno fell ill. He'd developed constipation, a common problem for elephants in captivity. usually caused by improper diet and lack of exercise. The papal physicians, having no idea how to treat an elephant, decided on a purgative, a laxative, laced with gold because they believed gold had medicinal properties. They gave this to a 7-year-old elephant suffering from respiratory problems and digestive distress. Hanno died. The gold poisoned him. Pope Leo was devastated. He'd been at Hanno's side when the elephant passed, and he did something remarkable. He composed a lengthy epitaph himself. Mighty elephant which the King Manuel, having conquered the Orient, sent as captive to Pope Leo X, at which the Roman people marvelled, a beast not seen for a long time, and in my brutish breast they perceived human feelings. Fate envied me my residence in the blessed Latium, and had not the patience to let me serve my master a full 3 years. But I wish, O gods, that the time which nature would have assigned to me and destiny stole away, you will add to the life of the great Leo. Read those lines again. In my brutish breast they perceived human feelings. Leo was writing from Hanno's perspective, acknowledging the elephant's emotional capacity, mourning the shortened life. This was a pope writing poetry for an elephant, commissioning Raphael to memorialize him, burying him in the Belvedere courtyard of the Vatican where Hanno had lived. In 1962, during construction of the Vatican Library's heating system, workers excavated elephant bones, right where Hanno had been buried. 446 years later, the elephant was still there, still keeping the Pope company. But here's something you might not know. Manuel tried to send Leo another gift, a rhinoceros, an animal even rarer than an elephant. The rhino had been living in Lisbon's royal menagerie, and it was spectacular. When they'd pitted it against an elephant in an arena, the rhino had lowered its horn and charged so aggressively that the elephant tore through an iron gate and ran back to its stable. The rhino was more formidable than any elephant. So in December, they packed the rhino onto a ship bound for Rome. It made a few appearances along the route, and then the ship sank. Rhinoceroses can swim, but this one was shackled to the deck. It drowned. Its carcass washed ashore at Villefranche on the French coast, and Manuel, undeterred, ordered it stuffed, mounted, and sent to Rome anyway. The Pope received a taxidermied rhinoceros as a consolation prize for his dead elephant. The artist Albrecht Dürer never saw that rhinoceros in person, but he created a famous woodcut based on descriptions. His rhinoceros, covered in plates of armour like a fantasy creature, became how Europeans imagined rhinos for the next 300 years. It was completely anatomically wrong, but it was the only image available, so it became truth. Dürer's rhinoceros appeared in books, maps, encyclopedias. One animal, drowned and stuffed, shaped European imagination for centuries. Now let's talk about logistics, because I think we've been glossing over the sheer impossibility of keeping elephants in medieval and Renaissance Europe. These animals need hundreds of pounds of food daily. Vegetation, specifically. Grasses, leaves, bark, fruits. Where do you get that in London in February? In Rome in winter? You don't, so you improvise. 80 loaves of bread for the Versailles elephant. Prime cuts of beef. 12 litres of wine daily. These weren't elephant diets. These were desperate attempts to feed an animal nobody understood. Elephants need to walk miles every day. In the wild, they roam enormous territories. Henry's elephant had a pen 40 feet by 20 feet. That's not even enough space to properly turn around. Hanno had a courtyard. Better, but still nowhere near adequate. These elephants lived in the equivalent of closets. Their feet hurt, their joints ached, their minds deteriorated from boredom and loneliness. Because elephants are intensely social. They live in matriarchal herds, form deep family bonds, remember relationships for decades. They mourn their dead. They have complex emotional lives, and every elephant in a European court was utterly alone. Hanno left his mother in India as a baby. Henry's elephant was captured as a juvenile in Africa. These animals spent their shortened lives in isolation, surrounded by humans who couldn't understand their distress. The mortality rate was essentially 100% within a few years. Not because elephants naturally die young, they can live 60 to 70 years in the wild, but because captivity killed them. Wrong food, wrong climate, wrong social structure, wrong everything. The love these monarchs felt was real. The care they attempted was genuine, but it was catastrophically inadequate, and yet people kept acquiring elephants. Henry VIII received an elephant, complete with its Indian keepers. There's a Latin text from 1519 that mentions an elephant given to the king, but none can guide him but they that came with the present. Even the elephant's original handlers couldn't make it cooperate. That elephant disappeared from records quickly, probably died quickly. What I find most poignant is the gap between intention and outcome. Leo genuinely loved Hanno. Henry was proud of his elephant. These weren't cruel men deliberately torturing animals. They were people who wanted to possess wonders, who believed that love and resources could overcome any obstacle. They were wrong. Some things cannot be owned, no matter how much you love them or how much gold you're willing to spend. Elephants in European courts were living symbols of empire, proof that European powers could reach across oceans and bring back the impossible. But they were also warnings. Warnings about the limits of human control, about the arrogance of believing you can domesticate the wild, about the cost of treating living beings as political currency. Those elephant bones buried under the Vatican, exhumed during construction centuries later, they tell a story. Not of glory or power or successful mastery of nature. They tell a story of a 7-year-old elephant who died because doctors gave him gold-laced medicine. They tell a story of good intentions producing terrible outcomes, and maybe that's the lesson we're still learning. But elephants weren't the only animals filling European skies with colour and sound. Because while some nobles wanted creatures so large they required their own buildings, others became obsessed with beings so delicate, so colourful, so otherworldly, that they seem to have flown straight from paradise itself. Birds. Thousands upon thousands of birds from every corner of the globe, creating symphonies in golden cages and dying in droves from stress and homesickness. Let's step into the aviaries, where beauty and tragedy flew together on fragile wings. Colour in feathers carries its own weight. Think about a world without screens, without photographs, without the ability to see images from distant lands. A world where colour itself was scarce and expensive, where most people wore browns and greys their entire lives, where dyes cost fortunes, where brightness meant wealth. And then imagine seeing for the first time a flamingo, pink, impossibly pink, standing on one leg, neck curved like a question mark, or a demoiselle crane with its elegant movements and crown of feathers dancing as if it knew it was being watched. These weren't just animals, these were living jewels, fragments of paradise, proof that somewhere in the world nature exploded into colours most people couldn't even imagine. European nobility became obsessed with birds. Absolutely, utterly obsessed. And unlike elephants that required architectural intervention, or cheetahs that needed expert handlers, birds could be collected in staggering numbers, hundreds of species, thousands of individual creatures, creating aviaries that sounded like the world singing all at once. Let me take you to Versailles in 1668, when the menagerie was finally complete and fully stocked. Walking through those 7 radiating courtyards, you wouldn't have seen mostly mammals. You would have seen birds everywhere. Birds were the majority population, the vast, overwhelming majority. The demoiselle cranes were the superstars. These elegant birds from North Africa, with their distinctive black and white plumage and graceful movements, became known as the royal bird. Artists painted them constantly. Writers described them in rapturous terms. Jean de La Fontaine wrote of their good grace and beauty in his romantic tale Les Amours de Psyché et Cupidon. Madeleine de Scudéry called them Egyptian chickens with obvious affection, though that nickname feels like calling a ballerina a dancing person, technically accurate but missing the majesty entirely. And here's what's fascinating. Contemporary visitors describe these cranes as dancing, not just moving, but performing. Scudéry wrote, "All those who have seen the birds in the Park of Versailles have much commented on how their gait, their gestures and their leaps have much in common with those of gypsy women whose dance they seem to imitate. One could say that they are pleased to show off their grace and skillful jumps, and that they follow people, not to have food thrown at them, but to be noticed. For when they see that they are watched, they begin to dance and to sing." Read that again. The cranes performed when they knew they were being watched. They wanted attention. They understood spectacle, and this delighted 17th century courtiers who recognized something of themselves in these birds. After all, court life at Versailles was perpetual performance. Everyone was always being watched, always needed to present themselves beautifully. The demoiselle cranes were living metaphors for the courtiers themselves, but the cranes were just the beginning. The courtyard designated for birds held 3 separate galleries, one for exotic chickens and game birds, peacocks with their impossible tail feathers, pheasants in bronze and gold, partridges. A second gallery for predatory and scavenger species, eagles with their piercing gazes, owls that would swivel their heads in unnerving ways, crows watching everything with intelligent eyes. And then there were the aquatic birds, dozens of species, flamingos standing in shallow pools, their pink feathers reflecting in the water, herons, statuesque and patient, waiting with the stillness that comes from being expert hunters, storks, massive and distinctive, carrying all their symbolic weight about babies and good fortune, egrets, white as snow, moving through water like ghosts. The sheer variety was overwhelming, and this wasn't even counting the cassowaries. Now cassowaries deserve their own moment, because they're extraordinary and terrifying in equal measure. The governor of Madagascar sent one to Louis XIV as a diplomatic gift. And this was a gift with an edge, because cassowaries are famously, dangerously aggressive. They're flightless birds, related to ostriches and emus, standing about 5 to 6 feet tall. They have brilliant blue heads and necks, powerful legs, and most notably dagger-like claws that can disembowel a predator with a single kick. They're called the world's most dangerous bird. And while that's slightly sensationalized, they absolutely can and have killed humans. So when the governor of Madagascar sent a cassowary to the King of France, he was sending a message layered with meaning. Look what I've captured for you. Look what I've controlled. Look how dangerous Madagascar is, and how capable I am of managing it. The cassowary wasn't just a gift. It was a flex. And Louis kept it, in a courtyard with other birds. Can you imagine being a flamingo just trying to exist peacefully, and there's a cassowary next door? The psychological terror alone. But here's what we haven't talked about yet. How did all these birds get to Versailles? Because this wasn't like ordering something online. This was an international logistics operation involving multiple ships, dangerous voyages, and mortality rates that should make us deeply uncomfortable. Colbert, Louis XIV's main minister, was tasked with stocking the menagerie. He approached Nicolas Arnoux, the treasurer of the galleys in Marseille, because almost all animals transited through that port, and Arnoux' job was to coordinate shipments from the French East India Company, which travelled to Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The mortality rate was catastrophic. Most animals, especially birds, didn't survive the journey. Young birds were captured because they were easier to transport, but that meant taking babies from nests, killing parents who tried to protect them. Then these traumatized young creatures were put on ships for months-long voyages through dangerous waters, extreme weather, cramped conditions, improper food. Colbert, trying to reduce the death toll, issued an order in 1669. Deliveries should only be made in summer, as if seasonal timing would solve the fundamental problem of keeping wild tropical birds alive on wooden ships crossing oceans. It helped, marginally, but the death rate remained enormous. One specialist, Monseigneur Gassion, made approximately 40 trips between 1671 and 1694. He brought back over 800 birds, including 103 ostriches in various shipments. Think about that logistics. 103 ostriches, each one standing 6 to 9 feet tall, weighing 200 to 300 pounds, each one needing vast amounts of food daily, each one capable of kicking with enough force to kill a lion. How do you transport 103 ostriches across the Mediterranean? Very carefully, apparently, and with massive losses. Contemporary accounts mention rumours that birds would die when they heard cannon fire from naval battles or even practice drills. The noise would startle them so severely that they'd panic, injure themselves, die from stress. Can you imagine? You're an ostrich, captured from African grasslands, put on a ship surrounded by strange sounds and smells and motion, and then cannons fire. The entire world explodes with noise. Your instinct says run, but there's nowhere to run. You're in a cage on a ship. The trauma alone. And even the birds that survived the journey often didn't last long in France. Wrong climate, wrong food, wrong social structures. Flamingos need specific algae to maintain their pink colour and their health. Without it, they fade, sicken, die. Tropical birds from humid jungles struggle in European winters. Migration birds kept in cages can't follow their instinctual need to fly thousands of miles. The Versailles Menagerie had a dovecote for 3,000 pigeons. 3,000 in one structure. Can you imagine the noise, the smell? Pigeons were kept partly because they were decorative, white doves being symbols of peace and purity, but also because they were food. The distinction between pet and dinner was fluid at Versailles. Some courtyards held birds to be admired, others held birds to be eaten. Sometimes the same bird could transition from one category to the other based on availability or royal whim. The paintings that survive from this period are haunting. Flemish artist Nicasius Bernertz was commissioned to paint portraits of all the animals arriving at Versailles. These paintings hung in the galleries, functioning like interpretive panels in a modern zoo. Visitors would see the painting first, preparing them for the living creature, and Bernertz painted with remarkable accuracy, capturing not just appearance, but personality. His demoiselle cranes look elegant, aware of their beauty. His cassowary looks exactly as dangerous as it was. But looking at these paintings now, knowing what we know about the conditions, the mortality rates, the brevity of these birds' lives, they feel elegiac. These weren't just portraits. They were memorials. Many of these birds were dead within months of arriving. The paintings outlasted the subjects, and the birds kept coming. Hummingbirds, tiny jewels barely bigger than large insects, impossibly delicate. They need to feed constantly, hovering at flowers, consuming nectar. Keeping hummingbirds alive in 17th century France must have been nearly impossible. What did they feed them? How did they provide proper flowers? Most hummingbirds probably died almost immediately. Parrots came from everywhere. Brazilian parrots in greens and blues and reds, African parrots, grey and elegant and intelligent, Asian parrots with distinctive crests and talking abilities. Every noble household wanted parrots because they were interactive, trainable, long-lived if cared for properly. But properly was beyond most people's understanding. And then there were the birds that existed in European imaginations before they existed in European reality. Ostriches, for instance. People had heard about these massive flightless birds from travellers' tales and ancient texts, but seeing one in person, utterly different. They're enormous, standing 8 feet tall. They can run 43 miles per hour. Their eggs are so large you could make omelettes for 20 people from a single egg. And their eyes, famously, are larger than their brains. A single shipment brought 103 ostriches over multiple voyages. That's not a pet collection. That's a population. And what happened to them all? Some died on the journey. Some died shortly after arrival. Some were kept in the menagerie. Some, undoubtedly, were eaten. Ostrich meat was considered exotic and delicious. The feathers were valuable for fashion and decoration. The eggs were curiosities, often decorated and displayed. Nothing went to waste. That's one thing we need to understand about these royal menageries. When animals died, and they died constantly, they were dissected. The Royal Academy of Sciences attended. Scientists documented anatomy, compared species, built understanding. The bones went to collections. The skins were sometimes preserved. These weren't just entertainment. They were outdoor laboratories, and death was part of the scientific process. But I want to tell you about one more bird, a bird that barely anyone has heard of, but that captivated 17th century France, the horn-billed crane. These birds, with their distinctive calls and unusual appearance, lived in courtyards alongside porcupines and foxes in what one account described as a cacophony of noise. Can you imagine the soundscape? Cranes calling, porcupines grunting, foxes barking, all echoing off stone walls, creating a symphony of animal voices that must have been audible across the entire Versailles estate. This was before people understood that animals need quiet to thrive, that stress kills, that constant human attention can be torture for wild creatures. Visitors would walk through continuously, pointing, exclaiming, making noise. Children would run and shriek with excitement, and the animals couldn't escape, couldn't hide, couldn't find peace. The wing clipping was routine. Most birds had their flight feathers trimmed regularly, ensuring they couldn't fly away. But imagine being a bird, being a creature whose entire evolutionary design is about flight, about freedom, about vast distances and open skies, and having that ability taken from you. You still have the instinct, your body still tries, but the feathers are gone, and when you jump, you fall. Some birds went mad from this. Historical accounts mention birds that would repeatedly attempt to fly, slamming into walls, injuring themselves. Birds that pluck their own feathers from stress. Birds that refuse to eat and slowly starved. These aren't failures of will. These are creatures dying from the psychological torture of captivity. And yet, Louis XIV loved his birds, genuinely loved them. He would arrive by boat sailing down the Grand Canal, making an entrance worthy of a sun king. He'd stroll through the courtyards, admiring the colours, the songs, the beauty. And I don't think he understood what he was doing. I don't think most people did. They saw beauty and wanted to possess it. They didn't see the cost. There's a letter from Colbert to Nicolas Arnoux that breaks my heart. He's writing about reducing mortality rates, about trying to ensure more animals survive, and his solution is better logistics, better timing, better transport. He's trying to minimize death within a fundamentally deadly system. Because the system itself, capturing wild animals, shipping them across oceans, keeping them in foreign climates in tiny spaces, that system is the problem. But nobody could imagine not doing it. The beauty was too compelling. By the time Louis XIV was approaching 60, he'd grown tired of his exotic birds. The novelty had worn off, so in 1698 he had the menagerie renovated and gave it to his 12-year-old granddaughter-in-law, Marie-Adélaïde of Savoy. And she loved it differently than he had. She used it as a refuge, an afternoon residence where she could escape the rigid formality of court. The birds provided her with something she desperately needed. Life that wasn't human, beauty that wasn't political, companionship without consequence. And maybe that's what all these birds really represented. Not just symbols of power or scientific curiosity or aesthetic achievement, but living reminders that the world was bigger than palaces, more colourful than courtiers, more beautiful than anything humans could create. The birds sang songs no composer had written. They wore colours no dyer could match. They moved with grace no dancer could emulate. But they paid for that beauty with their freedom, their families, their lives. And that's the tragedy we're still reckoning with. How do you love something so much that you'll destroy it to keep it close? How do you admire beauty while creating suffering? These are questions without easy answers. Now, we've talked about elephants that came as diplomatic gifts, cheetahs that hunted with emperors, birds that sang in golden cages. But there's one story we haven't touched yet, and it's my favourite because it's so absurdly human. A story about a very small dog, a very famous couple, and a wedding night that went spectacularly wrong. Because sometimes the most powerful people in Europe were completely at the mercy of a tiny animal with an attitude problem. Let me tell you about Napoleon, Josephine, and Fortune the pug, and why Napoleon apparently carried a scar from his wedding night for the rest of his life. Jealousy, it turns out, doesn't care about your military rank. March 9th, 1796, Paris. A small town hall hosts a civil ceremony. The groom arrives 2 hours late, a power move, though whether intentional or not, we'll never know. The bride is 32, a widow, fashionable and financially precarious. The groom is 26, a relatively unknown general with ambitions larger than anyone could imagine. Their ages on the marriage certificate are wrong. One witness is too young to legally serve as a witness. Everyone is in a terrible mood. Welcome to the wedding of Napoleon Bonaparte and Josephine de Beauharnais, and it's about to get much, much weirder. That evening, when Napoleon and his new bride returned home, he learned something that would define their relationship in ways no military strategy could have prepared him for. Josephine had a rule, a non-negotiable, absolute, unchangeable rule. Her pug, Fortune, slept in her bed. Every night. No exceptions, not even for a wedding night. Napoleon, standing there in his wedding finery, looked at the bed, at his new wife, at the small, wrinkly-faced pug already nestled in the blankets, staring at him with dark, suspicious eyes. And Josephine made the situation crystal clear. Either Napoleon could sleep elsewhere, or he could share the bed with Fortune. Those were the only options. Now, imagine being Napoleon Bonaparte. You've just married a woman you're utterly infatuated with. You're 26 years old, it's your wedding night, and your new wife is telling you that the dog stays. The dog who weighs maybe 15 pounds, who snores, who has made it abundantly clear through aggressive posturing that he does not approve of this new arrangement. Napoleon chose to share the bed, and he would later describe this decision to his friend, the French playwright Antoine Vincent Arnaud, with obvious bitterness. "Do you see that gentleman?" he said, pointing at Fortune on the sofa. "He is my rival. He was in possession of Madame's bed when I married her. I wished to remove him, but it was quite useless to think of it. I was told that I must either sleep elsewhere or consent to share my bed. That annoyed me considerably, but I had to make up my mind. I gave way. The favourite was less accommodating. Less accommodating is putting it mildly, because Fortune, protective of his mistress, possessive of his territory, and deeply opposed to this interloper, waited for his moment. And when Napoleon and Josephine were, shall we say, occupied with typical newlywed activities, Fortune attacked. He bit Napoleon on the leg. During, as Napoleon later phrased it with remarkable restraint, in flagrante delicto, the bite was serious enough to leave a scar, a permanent scar, that Napoleon carried for the rest of his life. Think about that. The man who would crown himself Emperor of France, who would redraw the map of Europe, who would be remembered for centuries as one of history's most influential military leaders, bore a scar on his leg from a pug who disapproved of his wedding night activities. Napoleon later described the aftermath with dark humour. "I bear proofs on my legs of what I say." The rest of that night was reportedly spent with Josephine applying compresses to Napoleon's calf, while he moaned that he was dying of hydrophobia, rabies, as we'd call it now. Dramatic, perhaps. But in 1796, without modern medicine, a dog bite was genuinely concerning. And being bitten by your wife's pug during your wedding night, that's a story that follows you. But Fortune's history with Josephine went deeper than simple pet ownership. This wasn't just a pampered lapdog. Fortune had saved Josephine's life, or at the very least her sanity. During the Reign of Terror in 1793 and 94, when Josephine's first husband was executed and she was imprisoned at Les Carmes prison, awaiting what seemed like inevitable execution herself, Fortune was her only allowed visitor. This tiny pug, small enough to slip through gates, would arrive with secret messages hidden under his collar, letters from her children, notes from allies, plans, hopes, connection to the outside world. Fortune gave Josephine a lifeline when she had nothing else. And when the terror ended abruptly, when Josephine was released just days before she would have been executed, Fortune remained her constant companion. So when Napoleon complained about sharing a bed, when he demanded the dog sleep elsewhere, Josephine had a very simple answer. No. Fortune had earned his place. Napoleon had not, and Fortune knew it. According to all accounts, the pug was bad-tempered, possessive, aggressive toward men, and completely devoted to Josephine. He'd spend his days in her apartments, lying on cushions, being fed delicacies, accepting the adoration of visitors. But let a man approach his mistress too familiarly, and Fortune would growl, snap, make his displeasure known. Napoleon tolerated this, barely. In letters to Josephine when he was away on campaign, he'd mention Fortune, usually with gritted teeth diplomacy. One letter from July 17, 1796, just 4 months after the disastrous wedding night, closes with, "Millions of kisses, some even to Fortune in spite of his naughtiness." You can almost hear the forced pleasantness in that line. in spite of his naughtiness. That's what you write when you want to tell your wife her dog is a demon, but you're trying to be romantic. In another letter, when Josephine had delayed for months joining Napoleon in Italy, making excuse after excuse, Napoleon's frustration boils over. He's jealous, suspicious, feeling neglected, and he ends one particularly angry letter by suggesting that maybe Josephine loves Fortune more than she loves him, which, to be fair, might have been true. Eventually, Josephine did travel to Milan to join Napoleon at his command post, and of course she brought Fortune. The pug became a fixture at military headquarters. According to an 1842 edition of the Court magazine and Monthly Critic, Fortune was caressed and petted by all the officers on the staff and regarded as an important personage at headquarters. Everyone loved Fortune, except Napoleon, who tolerated him for his wife's sake only. And then Fortune made a fatal error in judgment. One day, while roaming the gardens at their residence in Montebello, Fortune encountered the cook's dog. Different accounts describe this dog as either a mastiff or a bulldog, but all agree on one thing: he was massive. And when Fortune, with his characteristic aggressive confidence, started snapping and snarling, asserting his dominance the way he'd always done successfully with humans, the cook's dog did not respond the way Fortune expected. The mastiff seized Fortune in his jaws. One bite. The pug's ribs shattered. Josephine was devastated. Napoleon, according to historical accounts, was less so. When the cook approached him the next morning, apologizing profusely, explaining that he was keeping his dog locked up now, Napoleon's response was chilling in its casualness. Let him out. Perhaps he can rid me of this new one as well. Because Josephine, grieving, had already received a replacement pug from Lieutenant Hippolyte Charles, who was part of the household guard, and also one of Josephine's lovers. So now Napoleon was once again sharing his bedroom with a pug, this one a gift from his wife's paramour. The layers of humiliation were almost artistic in their complexity. But here's where Napoleon's relationship with dogs becomes genuinely fascinating. Because outside his household, away from Fortune and his replacement, Napoleon had very different experiences with dogs. And these experiences shaped him in ways that the biting pug never could. On the night after the Battle of Bassano, September 8th, 1796, General Napoleon walked across the battlefield. It was moonlit, beautiful in that terrible way battlefields can be when the fighting stops. Bodies lay everywhere, soldiers who'd been alive hours before, and then, from beneath the soldier's cloak, a dog emerged. He ran toward Napoleon, then immediately ran back to his dead master, licking the man's face, howling. Then back to Napoleon again, seeking help, seeking revenge, repeating this pattern over and over. Napoleon later dictated his memory of this moment to Emmanuel, the Comte de Las Cases, who transcribed the Emperor's memoirs, and Napoleon's words are haunting. I don't know whether it was the mood of the moment, or the place, or the time, or the action in itself, or what. At any rate, it's a fact that nothing I saw on any of my battlefields ever made such an impression on me. I stopped involuntarily to contemplate this spectacle. This man, I thought, has perhaps friends. Perhaps he has friends in his camp, in his company, and yet here he lies, abandoned by all save his dog. How mysterious is the human soul! What lesson in loyalty? Read that again. Nothing I saw on any of my battlefields ever made such an impression on me. This is a man who had witnessed countless battles, tremendous carnage, unimaginable human suffering. And what stopped him, what moved him to tears, was a dog mourning his master. The absolute, uncomplicated loyalty, the refusal to leave, the howling grief. It changed something in Napoleon. Not enough to make him love fortune, mind you, but enough to make him respect what dogs represented. Fidelity. Loyalty without calculation. Love without politics. And then, years later, a dog saved Napoleon's life. 1815. Napoleon is escaping from exile on Elba, attempting his famous return to power. The seas are rough, the boat is pitching, and Napoleon, standing at the gunwale for a last look at the island, loses his balance and falls overboard. He's wearing full military uniform, complete with the large iron sword he'd worn at the Battle of Austerlitz. He's not a strong swimmer under the best circumstances, and these are emphatically not the best circumstances. Napoleon is drowning, and a Newfoundland dog belonging to a local fisherman jumps into the water. Massive, powerful, bred for exactly this kind of work. The dog swims to Napoleon, keeps his head above water, gives the sailors time to turn the boat and pull the future emperor back to safety. An unnamed Newfoundland, acting on instinct and training, saved Napoleon Bonaparte, saved him to fight Waterloo, to experience final defeat, to be exiled again to St. Helena, where he'd die 6 years later. The irony wasn't lost on Napoleon. After being bitten by a pug on his wedding night, after tolerating fortune's hostility for years, after being, as he dramatically phrased it, defeated by dogs on the battlefield as well as in the bedroom, when he learned that a Newfoundland mascot on the British frigate HMS Nymph was first to board the surrendered French warship Cleopatra at the Battle of Trafalgar, Napoleon was saved by a dog. In his darkest moment, when all his human allies had failed or abandoned him, a dog pulled him from the sea. Napoleon would later write, "If you do not like dogs, you do not like fidelity. You do not like those who are attached to you, and therefore you are not faithful." This from a man whose first real encounter with a dog involved being bitten during intimate activities, but experience apparently taught him something. Dogs offered something humans couldn't: uncomplicated devotion, loyalty without agenda, although in a final twist of petty revenge, Napoleon as emperor passed a law making it illegal for anyone in France to name their dog Napoleon, which is simultaneously understandable and absolutely hilarious. The most powerful man in Europe, who owed his life to a dog, who'd been moved to tears by a dog's grief, who philosophized about canine fidelity, still couldn't quite forgive the indignity of fortune. And there's one last chapter to this story. The last surviving descendant of the Bonaparte family, Jerome Napoleon Bonaparte, died in New York City in 1945. He was an elderly man taking his dog for a walk in Central Park. The dog saw something exciting, darted forward. Jerome stumbled over the leash, fell, and sustained injuries that would prove fatal. The Bonaparte line, which had survived revolutions and wars and exiles and emperors, ended with a man tripping over his dog's leash. You couldn't write fiction that perfect, so what do we take from Napoleon and his complicated relationship with dogs? Maybe that power and vulnerability exist together, that the mighty can be undone by the small, that loyalty, when found, is precious regardless of species, that holding grudges against pugs is both reasonable and ridiculous, that love, whether for a person or a pet, makes us behave in ways logic can't explain. Josephine chose fortune over Napoleon's comfort, and Napoleon, despite everything, stayed. He complained, certainly. He bore the scar, literally, but he stayed. And decades later, he could acknowledge that the dog mourning his master on a battlefield taught him something about fidelity that no human ever had. Now, we've explored intimate relationships between kings and elephants, nobles and tiny ferrets, Napoleon and a very judgmental pug. But there's one story left, one journey that captured European imagination like nothing else. A story about an animal so tall it seemed impossible, so elegant it inspired fashion, travelling across an entire continent on foot because everyone needed to witness the miracle. Let me tell you about Zarafa, the giraffe who walked to Paris, and how one animal's 5,000-mile journey changed how an entire continent understood beauty, wonder, and the natural world. Sometimes a miracle walks on 4 legs at exactly 2 miles per hour. 1826, the port of Marseille, October 31st. A ship arrives carrying something France has never seen before. Something most Europeans have only encountered in medieval bestiaries, where artists, lacking any actual reference, drew creatures that looked like confused collaborations between horses, camels, and leopards. Something so improbable that witnesses struggle to believe their own eyes. A giraffe, 12 feet tall, already taller than any building in most villages she'll pass through, and she's about to walk to Paris, on foot, 550 miles, through the French countryside, in winter, wearing a custom-made raincoat. Her name, though she wouldn't receive it officially until 1985, was Zarafa, Arabic for both giraffe and lovely one, a doubly perfect name for an animal whose very existence seemed to prove that the world was more wonderful than anyone had imagined. But Zarafa's journey to Marseille was already the stuff of legend, and it started 4,000 miles away, in the highlands near Senna in Sudan, with a tragedy that's impossible to ignore. Arab hunters found a 2-month-old giraffe calf with her mother. They killed the mother, took the baby, loaded her, already 6 feet tall despite her age, onto a camel's back. An unweaned infant, torn from the only being who could have cared for her, beginning a journey that would take 2 years and span a quarter of the globe. She was a diplomatic gift, or more accurately, a desperate political gambit. Muhammad Ali, Ottoman viceroy of Egypt, was commanding Turkish forces fighting against Greek independence. England, France, and Russia were all considering intervention on behalf of the Greeks, and Bernardino Drovetti, the French consul general in Egypt, also, notably, the first wholesale tomb robber of modern Egyptology, a man who sent entire collections of Egyptian artifacts to European museums, convinced Muhammad Ali that an extraordinary present might persuade France to stay neutral. What's more extraordinary than a giraffe? The last giraffe seen in Europe had belonged to a Medici prince in Florence in 1486, 340 years earlier. Nobody living in 1826 had ever seen one. Most people didn't truly believe they existed. They were creatures of mythology, impossibilities, combinations of other animals that couldn't possibly be real. So they captured Zarafa, sent her by camel to Khartoum. From there she travelled down the Blue Nile on a specially constructed felucca, drinking 25 litres of milk daily from 3 cows who travelled with her. Nearly 2,000 miles down the Nile to Alexandria, where she lived outside Muhammad Ali's palace while a ship was prepared for the Mediterranean crossing. The brigantine and Du Fratelli underwent modifications. They cut a hole in the deck, built Zarafa a special stall in the cargo hold where she could stand. Giraffes can't lie down for extended periods without risking death. With her long neck protruding up through the deck, her head above, exposed to Mediterranean sun and spray. They padded the hole with straw, tied an amulet stuffed with Quran verses around her neck with red ribbon for protection, loaded her 3 milk cows aboard, and Zarafa stood there, like a living ship's mast, a bizarre figurehead, for 32 days crossing the Mediterranean. Imagine being a sailor on another ship passing this vessel and seeing a giraffe's head and neck rising from the deck. You'd think you'd gone mad, or that you'd sailed off the edge of the known world into somewhere ruled by different laws of nature. She arrived in Marseille on October 31st, 1826, taller than when she'd left Alexandria, healthier somehow despite the voyage, and officials immediately faced a problem. How do you transport a 12-foot-tall giraffe from Marseille to Paris? By ship around the Iberian Peninsula, up the Atlantic coast, up the Seine. Too dangerous. The seas could be rough, the journey long, and the precious cargo couldn't be risked. Someone made a decision that seems simultaneously insane and perfect. She would walk 550 miles through one of the coldest winters France had experienced in years. They'd give her the entire winter to rest and acclimatise in Marseille, then set out in spring when the weather improved, and they assigned her an escort befitting her importance. Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, one of France's foremost natural historians and scientists, would personally accompany Zarafa. Her Sudanese handler Atia, who'd been with her since Sudan, would continue caring for her. Hassan, an Arab groom, would assist. 3 milk cows would provide her daily nutrition. 2 mouflon sheep and an antelope would join the parade. 3 footmen, each with leather leashes to ensure no pulling, would guide her. Mounted guards for protection, and they made her a 2-piece waxed raincoat to protect her from spring weather. Picture that. Picture this entire cavalcade, a giraffe in a raincoat, accompanied by cows and sheep, and an antelope and scientists and guards, setting out on foot to walk across France. They departed May 20th, 1827, and from the very first mile Zarafa was a sensation. Word spread faster than the caravan moved. People poured out of fields and vineyards and distant villages. They'd heard rumours, read newspapers, seen sketches, but nothing prepared them for the reality, for the height, the grace, the impossible neck, the delicate movements, the huge gentle eyes looking down at them from what seemed like the sky. In Aix-en-Provence, officials organised 2 separate parades through the Cours Mirabeau, morning and evening, to accommodate maximum crowds. Because everyone needed to see. Everyone. It wasn't optional. This was the most remarkable thing that would happen in most people's entire lives, in a world without television, without photography, without any way to see distant wonders except in person. Zarafa was a walking miracle. The journey averaged 2 miles per hour. Sometimes they covered 12 miles in a day, sometimes less. Zarafa walked with that distinctive giraffe gait, moving both right legs together, then both left legs, creating a rolling, almost ship-like motion. She was patient, gentle, curious. When the cavalcade stopped in towns, she'd bend her neck down to accept offerings of flowers or vegetables from children. She seemed to understand she was the centre of attention, and unlike many animals thrust into such situations, she appeared to enjoy it. June 6th. Lion. 30,000 people gathered. 30,000. That was nearly a third of Lyon's entire population at the time. The city essentially shut down. Everyone came to see. Grandparents brought grandchildren. People travelled from surrounding villages, walking for hours or days. Because when would they ever have another chance to see a giraffe? The newspapers followed Zarafa's progress obsessively. Sketches appeared in every publication. Artists rushed to render her, and everyone had opinions. About her height, she was growing, gaining weight, looking healthier every day. About her personality, gentle, intelligent, patient. About her beauty, the distinctive spots, the elegant movements, the impossible proportions that somehow worked perfectly. Zarafa wore her custom raincoat when weather demanded, a 2-piece garment, carefully designed to fit her unusual body. And yes, a giraffe in a raincoat walking through the French countryside should be ridiculous. But somehow it wasn't. Somehow it was touching. evidence of human care for this extraordinary creature, evidence that people were trying, however imperfectly, to protect her. King Charles X was desperate to meet her. He wanted to ride out, intercept the cavalcade, see Zarafa before she reached Paris, but his advisers counselled royal decorum. Kings do not chase giraffes through the countryside, Your Majesty. The giraffe must come to the king. So Charles waited, impatiently, while Zarafa made her stately progress north. 41 days after leaving Marseille on July 9th, 1827, Zarafa reached Paris, and the city lost its collective mind. Thousands met her at the southern edge, following her procession through the streets. She arrived at the Jardin des Plantes, the Royal Botanical Garden and Menagerie. Naturalists examined her immediately. Was she tired? Lame? Stressed from the journey? She'd gained weight. Her coat was glossier, smoother. She was, in the words of contemporary observers, as debonair as she is intelligent. 600 miles on foot and she'd thrived. Whatever concerns people had about transporting her by sea or cart, walking turned out to be exactly right. Zarafa had crossed France at her own pace, resting when needed, eating well, receiving constant care and attention from Attir, who loved her. On July 9th, Zarafa was presented to King Charles X at the Chateau of Saint-Cloud. Standing nearly 13 feet tall now, she bent her neck in what seemed like a bow. Charles was enchanted. His children were enchanted. Everyone who witnessed the meeting was enchanted. This animal, this impossible, graceful, gentle creature, had walked across France to reach them. That summer alone, over 600,000 people visited Zarafa at the Jardin des Plantes. 600,000. Paris had a population of about 800,000 at the time. 3/4 of Paris came to see the giraffe, plus visitors from across France and Europe. Lines wrapped around buildings. People waited hours for a glimpse, and giraffomania swept France. Hair was styled à la girafe, towering constructions that added sometimes a foot or more to women's heights. Spotted fabrics became the rage. Porcelain featured giraffe imagery. Men wore giraffe portraits on neckties. Children ate giraffe-shaped cookies. The colour belly of giraffe, a subtle cream yellow, became wildly popular for clothing and home decor. Honoré de Balzac wrote a story about her. Young Gustave Flaubert travelled from Rouen specifically to see her. Artists competed to paint her most accurately. Nicholas U.S. portraits captured her elegant neck and proud bearing. Jacques Laurent Agasse painted her with extraordinary detail. Zarafa wasn't just a curiosity. She was a superstar, a celebrity, a phenomenon. She represented something profound. Proof that the world was larger and stranger and more beautiful than anyone had imagined. In an age of increasing scientific understanding, when Enlightenment thinking emphasized reason and observation, Zarafa was both validation and wonder. She was real, she existed, and she was magnificent. But here's what makes me think about this story with complicated feelings. Muhammad Ali sent 3 giraffes to European rulers that year, one to France, one to Britain for King George IV, one to Austria. The Austrian giraffe died within a year, partly from an arduous crossing of the Alps. The British giraffe, despite being a key attraction at the new London Zoo in Regent's Park, survived only 2 years. She was so weakened by her journey that she could barely support her own weight. She stood, she suffered, she died, and then she was stuffed by John Gould for display. Zarafa lived 18 more years. 18. At the Jardin des Plantes, attended daily by Attir, who slept near her every night until her death. She was cared for with genuine affection. She had space to move, proper food, companionship in the form of other animals, and she became, in her way, Parisian, a resident, a fixture of the city's life. But she also spent 18 years in captivity. This animal, whose ancestors evolved to roam vast African savannas, who should have travelled miles daily searching for acacia trees, who should have lived in herds with complex social structures, spent nearly 2 decades in an enclosure in Paris. Loved, yes. Cared for, certainly. But confined. Forever separated from her homeland, her species, everything natural to her. Did the diplomatic gift work? No. Muhammad Ali's navy was destroyed at the Battle of Navarino in October 1827, just months after Zarafa reached Paris. The French showed no concern for the donor. England and France intervened in Greece. Muhammad Ali lost his entire fleet. The gift that cost a mother giraffe her life, that displaced a baby across continents, that was meant to prevent a war, changed nothing politically. But it changed everything culturally, because Zarafa showed an entire continent something they'd forgotten, that wonder still existed, that the natural world contained creatures so extraordinary that seeing them felt like witnessing miracles, that beauty and strangeness and grace could coexist in ways that defied imagination. When Zarafa died in January 1845, aged approximately 21, Paris mourned. She was taxidermied, preserved, put on display at the Museum of Natural History. Later, she travelled one final time to La Rochelle, where she remains today, a museum piece, a memory of the moment when one giraffe walked into France and changed how people saw the world. But I keep thinking about Zarafa's mother, about that 2-month-old calf on a camel's back, beginning an impossible journey, about Atia, who cared for her with obvious devotion for 19 years, about the crowds who saw her not as a political pawn but as a living wonder, about the contradiction at the heart of this story, genuine love and care producing what was still fundamentally captivity. Muhammad Ali wanted to manipulate politics, France wanted to possess wonder, and Zarafa, innocent of all these human intentions, simply lived. Walking across France, accepting flowers from children, standing patiently while thousands stared, spending her years in an enclosure in Paris. She was loved, and she was trapped. Both things were true. Now we've journeyed through centuries of exotic pets, from Charlemagne's elephant to Zarafa's walk. We've seen glory and tragedy, love and loss, wonder and suffering, all intertwined in ways that defy simple judgment. But there's one final question we haven't answered. What happened to all this? When did it end? How did we get from kings keeping cheetahs and emperors walking giraffes through cities to the world we know now, where such things are unthinkable? Because somewhere between Zarafa's triumphant arrival and today, something fundamental changed in how humans relate to wild animals, and that transformation, that shift from possession to protection, from menageries to conservation, holds lessons we're still learning. Let's close this journey by understanding how the age of royal exotic pets finally came to an end, and what we lost and gained in the transition. Revolutions, it turns out, free more than just people. 1789, Paris. The Bastille falls. The French Revolution begins. And in the chaos that follows, as the old order crumbles and new ideas about liberty, equality and fraternity sweep through France, someone asks a question that hadn't been seriously considered before. What about the animals? The royal menagerie at Versailles, that architectural marvel we discussed earlier, that testament to Louis XIV's power and vision, suddenly found itself in a very awkward position. It was royal, and France was rapidly deciding it didn't want royals anymore. The animals living there, exotic birds from Africa and Asia, mammals from distant continents, creatures collected over decades, were symbols of monarchical excess, of wealth squandered on vanity while people starved. During the Revolution, the Versailles Menagerie was largely abandoned. Some animals were killed and eaten by starving Parisians. Others were sold off. Guards fled or were reassigned. The grand octagonal pavilion, once immaculate, fell into disrepair. By 1793, only 5 animals remained. 5, out of what had once been hundreds of species and thousands of individual creatures. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn, because the revolutionaries, despite their rage against royal excess, didn't want to destroy all the animals. They wanted to democratize them, to make them available to the people. Science, after all, was for everyone, not just aristocrats. Knowledge should be shared. Wonder shouldn't be hoarded by kings. So the surviving animals from Versailles were transferred to the Jardin des Plantes, the Royal Botanical Garden in Paris, which was transformed into the National Museum of Natural History. Public, accessible, educational. This wasn't a menagerie anymore. This was a zoo, the first modern zoo, open to everyone, where knowledge about animals could be studied, shared, disseminated. The shift was profound. Animals went from being possessions of the powerful to being, well, still captive, certainly. But now they were held in the name of science and public education rather than private prestige. It was still problematic in many ways, but it was different, fundamentally different, and this transformation spread. The menagerie at Vincennes, where Louis XIV had once held animal fights for entertainment, closed permanently. The practice of staging combat between animals, which had been popular entertainment for centuries, became increasingly distasteful to educated people. Violence for entertainment's sake was falling out of favour. The Enlightenment emphasised reason, observation, understanding. Cruelty was crude, unenlightened. 1824, Britain. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was founded. The RSPCA, the first animal welfare organisation in the world. And here's something remarkable. Queen Victoria became its first royal patron. Queen Victoria, who'd kept numerous exotic pets herself, who'd had parrots and dogs and been painted with her beloved animals, publicly endorsed an organisation dedicated to preventing cruelty to animals. Think about what that represents. A fundamental shift in thinking. Animals still suffered, certainly. They were still exploited, still used, still confined. But there was growing recognition that suffering was wrong, that cruelty wasn't acceptable, that humans had responsibilities toward the creatures in their care. The Victorian era saw pet ownership become democratized. It wasn't just royalty keeping animals anymore. The rising middle class wanted pets too. Dogs became ubiquitous. Cats, once associated with witchcraft, became respectable. Exotic animals became attractions at public zoos rather than private menageries. The prestige shifted from owning unusual animals to protecting them, but the exotic pet trade continued, and it continued to devastate wild populations. Remember those Asiatic cheetahs we discussed? The ones Akbar kept by the thousands? They were functionally extinct in India by the early 20th century, hunted to near extinction partly for the exotic pet trade, partly for sport, partly because their habitat was destroyed. 9,000 cheetahs under one emperor, and within a few centuries they were gone from the entire Indian subcontinent. The lesson was brutal and clear. Loving something to death is still death. Possession, no matter how well-meaning, no matter how genuine the affection, can be destruction. The very desire to own these creatures, to keep them close, to control them, killed them. Not through cruelty or neglect, but through sheer volume, through the accumulated weight of human desire. 1834. The Tower of London Menagerie, which had housed exotic animals since the 13th century, remember Henry III's elephant, closed permanently. The animals were transferred to the new Zoological Society of London's zoo in Regent's Park. Public, scientific, educational. The transition was complete in Britain. Royal menageries belonged to the past. Zoos represented the future. But zoos in the 19th and early 20th centuries were still deeply problematic. Animals lived in small concrete enclosures. They paced endlessly, driven mad by boredom and confinement. They were displayed like curiosities, like living museum pieces, with little understanding of their psychological or physical needs. Progress was happening, but it was slow, painfully slow. The early 20th century brought new concerns. Conservation. The word itself gained new meaning, because people were finally noticing something terrifying. Species were disappearing, not just declining, vanishing entirely. And the exotic pet trade was a significant factor. Every cheetah in a European menagerie meant fewer cheetahs in the wild. Every parrot in a cage meant disrupted breeding populations. Every elephant shipped to Europe meant families destroyed. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, laws began to change. Countries started restricting the import of wild animals. International agreements formed around protecting endangered species. The Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, CITES, was established in 1973. It regulated the trade in endangered animals and plants, made it harder to simply capture whatever you wanted and ship it wherever you pleased. Modern zoos began emphasizing conservation and breeding programs. The goal shifted from display to preservation. Zoos became genetic reservoirs, maintaining populations of species that were extinct in the wild. The California condor, brought back from the brink. The Arabian oryx, extinct in the wild and then reintroduced. Black-footed ferrets, Przewalski's horses, species that would be completely gone without captive breeding programs. It's imperfect. God, it's imperfect. Keeping wild animals in captivity is still fundamentally compromised. They still suffer from boredom, stress, lack of space, inability to express natural behaviors. But the alternative, watching them go extinct because we destroyed their habitats and hunted them to oblivion, is worse. We're in a situation where captivity is sometimes the only option for survival, and that's a tragedy we created. But here's what I want you to understand. The shift from royal menageries to modern conservation represents a change in how we think about our relationship with nature, from dominion to stewardship, from possession to protection, from I own this to I'm responsible for this. King Louis XIV could command that an elephant be brought to Versailles, and it was done. Nobody questioned whether the elephant wanted to be there. Nobody considered the elephant's family, the elephant's needs, the elephant's dignity as a living being. The elephant was a possession, a symbol, a tool for demonstrating power. Today, if you tried to capture an elephant from the wild and bring it to Europe, you'd face international outrage, legal consequences, and moral condemnation. The shift is real, incomplete, imperfect, but real. And the stories we've explored throughout this journey, Charlemagne's Abul Abbas, Emperor Akbar's 9,000 cheetahs, Pope Leo's beloved Hano, King George's parrot Charlotte, Napoleon and Fortune the pug, Zarafa's walk to Paris, they're not just entertaining historical anecdotes. They're evidence of how humans have struggled to understand our place in the natural world, how we've slowly, painfully, learned that love can be destructive, that wonder doesn't justify captivity, that admiration should lead to protection, not possession. Queen Victoria, patron of the RSPCA, still kept exotic pets. The contradiction was real, but she was part of a generation beginning to question practices that had been unquestioned for millennia, beginning to ask whether keeping animals for entertainment or prestige was actually ethical, beginning to shift thinking. We're still in that shift. The exotic pet trade still exists, still threatens wild populations, tigers in private collections in America, parrots smuggled illegally, primates kept in conditions that would horrify anyone who understood their needs. We haven't solved this. We're still learning. But we've learned some things. We've learned that cheetahs don't breed in captivity without very specific conditions. We've learned that elephants need space and family groups and mental stimulation. We've learned that parrots live 60, 70, 80 years and form bonds that last lifetimes. We've learned that taking an animal from the wild creates trauma that often kills them, even if we feed them well and house them comfortably. We've learned, in other words, that these aren't possessions. They're not decorations or status symbols or political tools. They're beings with their own needs, their own lives, their own right to exist in the world they evolved for. The age of royal exotic pets ended not with a single event, but with a gradual awakening, a recognition that spread across decades and centuries, that the elephant who needed a crane to stand was suffering, that the birds who died hearing cannon fire deserved better, that Fortune the pug, carrying messages for Josephine during the Terror, had more value than just being a weapon against Napoleon on his wedding night, that Zarafa, walking across France, was more than a diplomatic tool. She was a living miracle who deserved more than 18 years in an enclosure. And maybe that's the real story here. Not that humans kept exotic pets. We've always done that. But that we began, however slowly, to question whether we should, to consider the cost, to weigh our desires against their needs, to recognize that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is leave wild creatures wild. The royal menageries are gone. The Tower of London no longer houses lions. Versailles is a museum, its octagonal pavilion demolished, its courtyards repurposed. The practice of kings parading cheetahs at weddings or popes receiving elephants as coronation gifts belongs to history. But the legacy remains. In our zoos, where conservation has become the mission. In our laws protecting endangered species. In our growing understanding that the natural world doesn't exist for our entertainment. In our recognition that the most extraordinary thing about a wild animal is its wildness. And taking that away, no matter how much we love them, diminishes both them and us. So what do we do with these stories? These tales of elephant who drank 12 litres of wine daily and died within 2 years? Of 9,000 cheetahs who passed through one emperor's collection and then went extinct in an entire subcontinent? Of a giraffe who walked to Paris and lived 18 years separated from everything natural to her? We remember them. We honour the genuine affection people felt for these animals. We acknowledge the wonder they inspired. And we commit to doing better, to protecting habitats instead of collecting specimens, to observing in the wild instead of confining in enclosures, to understanding that the most profound way to love wild animals is to ensure they remain wild. The age of royal exotic pets taught us something precious, that humans are capable of tremendous care and devotion toward other species. But it also taught us something painful, that care without wisdom can be destructive, that love without understanding can kill. that good intentions aren't enough. We're still learning these lessons every day in how we treat wildlife, in how we manage conservation, in how we think about our relationship with the natural world. The journey isn't over, but at least we're asking the right questions now. At least we're beginning to understand that the elephant's place is in Africa, the cheetah's place is on African grasslands, the giraffe's place is under acacia trees in the savannah, and sometimes the most loving thing we can do is admire from a distance, to let wonder exist without possessing it, to protect instead of collect, to ensure that the next generation sees elephants and cheetahs and giraffes not in museums or history books, but alive, wild, free, in the places they belong. That's the gift we can give them. The gift they could never give themselves because we took their freedom first. Redemption through protection. Atonement through conservation. Love expressed not through possession, but through release. The royal exotic pets of European nobility are gone, and maybe, just maybe, that's exactly as it should be. Thank you so much for staying with me through this long journey into history's most unusual relationships. We've travelled from Charlemagne's 8th century palace to Victorian England, from Indian grasslands to the Tower of London, from the Vatican to Versailles. We've met elephants and cheetahs and parrots and pugs and a giraffe who walked 550 miles to capture a continent's heart. These stories matter because they show us who we've been, who we're becoming, and who we still need to be. They remind us that history isn't just about kings and battles and treaties. It's also about the small moments. A queen commissioning a pearl collar for her squirrel, an emperor crying over a dog mourning its master, a pug biting Napoleon on his wedding night, a giraffe patiently accepting flowers from children along a French road. If you found value in this exploration of history's stranger status symbols, I hope you'll hit that subscribe button and let me know your thoughts in the comments. What story surprised you most? What animal would you have wanted to meet? And what lessons do you think we're still learning? And please, stay with me. Because history is full of more stories like these. Stories that seem impossible, but are absolutely true. Stories that make us laugh and cry and think differently about the world. Stories that remind us that humans have always been complicated, contradictory, capable of both tremendous compassion and breathtaking thoughtlessness. I'll be back soon with another journey into the past. Another deep dive into the moments that shaped us. Another night of storytelling, of discovery, of understanding. Until then, sleep well. Dream of elephants and giraffes. And maybe tomorrow, look at the natural world a little differently, with a little more wonder, a little more respect, a little more recognition that we share this planet with creatures whose lives matter just as much as ours do. Good night, everyone. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.